What if I told you that one of the most dominant stretches in NASCAR history wasn't just built on skill, determination, or even superior engineering? What if it was built on something you can buy at any hardware store for $3? We're talking about wax. Common, everyday, nothing special paraffin wax. And the man who figured out how to use it didn't have a computer, a PhD, or even a fancy engineering degree. He had a workbench, a sharp mind, and the audacity to try something so simple it almost sounds like a joke. But it wasn't a joke. It won races. And when the people in charge finally figured out what was happening, they couldn't believe what they were looking at. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the hidden engineering tricks, backroom innovations, and rule-bending schemes that shaped professional racing. If you're someone who loves the real stories behind motorsport, the ones they don't put in the press releases or the official histories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, before we get into the wax itself, I need you to understand something about NASCAR in the early 1980s. Because without that context, the story doesn't hit nearly as hard. This was an era where the rulebook was more of a suggestion than a law. Teams ran acid-dipped body panels to shave weight. Fuel additives bordered on aviation-grade rocket propellant. Hydraulic suspension systems could literally lower a car during a race to improve aerodynamics. It was the Wild West of American motorsport, and the attitude was simple. If you're not cheating, you're not trying. That culture is essential to understanding what happened next, because what Maurice Petty did wasn't born in a vacuum. It was born in a garage full of guys who saw rules as puzzles to be solved rather than lines to stay inside of. Now, here's the thing about Maurice Petty. Most people know his brother Richard, the king himself, the 7-time champion with 200 career victories and a smile that became as famous as his number 43 STP Pontiac. But Maurice? Maurice was the quiet one, the engine builder, the man behind the curtain. While Richard was signing autographs and waving to the crowd, Maurice was back in Level Cross, North Carolina, doing math that nobody else was doing and asking questions nobody else thought to ask. And one of those questions changed everything. The question was this: what if an engine could pass a legal inspection at 358 cubic inches, which was the strict maximum NASCAR allowed at the time, and then somehow become bigger during the race? Now, you might be thinking that sounds physically impossible. You can't just make an engine grow. Metal doesn't expand that dramatically. The cylinders are what they are. And you'd be right if you were only thinking about metal. But Maurice wasn't thinking about metal. He was thinking about wax. Here's what most people don't realize about how NASCAR inspections worked in 1983. Inspectors checked engine displacement using a pump system. They'd rotate the crankshaft to bottom dead center, inject fluid into each cylinder, and measure the exact volume. Add all 8 cylinders together and you get your total displacement. Simple, accurate, effective. But here's the critical detail that Maurice Petty saw and nobody else did. The inspection happened with a cold engine, room temperature, maybe 65 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, once you passed, the assumption was that your engine stayed legal for the rest of the event. Nobody checked again. At least not routinely. That gap, that window between cold inspection and hot racing, was where Maurice went to work. Paraffin wax melts at around 140 degrees Fahrenheit. A NASCAR engine running at full race pace generates coolant temperatures around 200 degrees and combustion chamber temperatures that climb far beyond that. So if you carefully pressed measured amounts of wax into the combustion chambers before inspection, the wax would take up space, artificially reducing the measured displacement. The engine checks in at 358. Legal, clean, no flags. But the moment that engine fires up and starts building heat, the clock starts ticking. Lap after lap, the temperature climbs. And somewhere around lap 10 to lap 15, the wax doesn't just soften. It liquefies completely. It gets atomized by combustion and blown out through the exhaust system in microscopic droplets that leave virtually no trace. And suddenly, Richard Petty is driving a 373 cubic inch engine, while every other car on the track is stuck at 358. 15 cubic inches of pure, invisible advantage, appearing from nowhere, leaving no evidence, gone before the checkered flag. The general rule of thumb in motorsport is that every cubic inch of displacement is worth roughly 2 horsepower at peak output. Do that math and you're looking at a 25 to 30 horsepower advantage. In a sport where entire seasons are decided by margins measured in fractions of a second, that's not a small edge. That's a chasm. That's the difference between chasing the leader and lapping the field. Think of it this way. Imagine you're running a foot race against someone, and you've both agreed to wear identical shoes. But your competitor has somehow figured out how to swap their shoes mid-race for ones with springs in the soles. And by the time anyone thinks to check, the springs have dissolved. That's what was happening at racetracks across America in the early 1980s. Richard Petty would pull away on the straights with a kind of authority that the other drivers simply couldn't explain. They'd test their own engines on the dynamometer and see comparable power numbers. They'd examine their setups and find nothing wrong. But on track, especially after 50 or 100 miles, the 43 car would just walk away from the field like it had found an extra gear that everyone else was missing. Junior Johnson, himself a legendary figure in the history of creative rule interpretation, admitted years later that he knew something was going on. He said that the Petty motor would come alive around lap 20 and that his crew had torn their own engines apart looking for what the Pettys had found. They never found it because they were looking for a mechanical solution to what was actually a chemical one. The preparation that went into making this work was extraordinary. Maurice couldn't just dump random amounts of wax into a cylinder and hope for the best. He had to calculate precise volumes for each individual combustion chamber, accounting for the shape of the chamber, the valve pockets, the spark plug location, and the compression ratio. Too much wax and the engine fails inspection. Too little and you leave power on the table. The margin for error was essentially zero. The type of wax mattered enormously. Standard candle wax would leave residue that could foul spark plugs, contaminate oil, or damage valve seat. Maurice needed something that would melt cleanly and completely, burning off without a trace. After what had to have been extensive secret testing, they settled on a specific grade of paraffin with a melting point that was low enough to liquefy quickly during race conditions but high enough to remain solid and stable throughout the pre-race inspection process. Getting that specification exactly right was itself an engineering achievement. Installing the wax was described by people familiar with the process as an art form. You'd warm it just enough to make it pliable, press it carefully into the combustion chambers so that it conformed perfectly to every surface without trapping air pockets, and then let it cool and harden before the engine was assembled. The whole process added hours to engine preparation. But when the payoff is 25 extra horsepower that appears out of thin air and vanishes before anyone can catch it, those hours were well spent. This is where it gets really interesting. Maurice didn't just throw wax in and call it a day. He had to engineer the rest of the motor around this trick. A bigger effective displacement changes everything. It changes your air and fuel requirements. It changes your ignition timing. It changes how your exhaust system scavenges spent gases. The camshaft profile that works perfectly for 358 cubic inches might be completely wrong for 373. So what Maurice built was essentially a transformer engine, one that ran adequately at 358 cubic inches during inspection and qualifying, and then transformed into something genuinely special once the wax melted away and the full displacement came online. The camshaft was ground with a profile that would really sing at 373 cubic inches. The carburetor was jetted rich enough to feed the bigger displacement once it emerged. The headers and exhaust pipes were tuned for the larger motor, which meant the engine was actually giving up some performance during the early lap. But once everything came online, once the wax was gone and the displacement jumped, all of those components worked in perfect harmony. It was like a symphony where the conductor knows that some instruments don't join until the third movement. Everything was designed around that moment when the engine became what it was always meant to be. They built a private dynamometer cell at the Petty shop specifically for testing these engines. They'd run simulated race cycles for hours, watching the power curve shift in real time. At startup, roughly 620 horsepower. After 5 minutes of running, 635. After 10 minutes, 645. Once all the wax was gone, a steady 650 horsepower. That 30 horsepower gain wasn't just about peak numbers either. The extra displacement fattened up the entire torque curve, making the engine pull harder coming out of corners and carry speed more effectively through traffic. Richard could drive the car differently than his competitors. He could use lines that only worked with that extra grunt underneath him. Now, before we talk about how this all came crashing down, I want to pause on something that often gets overlooked in this story. The sheer audacity of what they were attempting. Think about who we're talking about. This wasn't some backmarker team with nothing to lose. This was Petty Enterprises, the most storied team in NASCAR history. Richard Petty was the face of the sport, a 7-time champion, a cultural icon who was as close to royalty as American motorsport had ever produced. If this scheme was discovered, the fallout wouldn't just be a fine or a points penalty. It would be a scandal that could taint an entire legacy. And yet Maurice pressed wax into those cylinders anyway. That tells you everything you need to know about the competitive culture inside that garage. Winning wasn't just important. It was the only thing that mattered. The 1983 season opened with promise. Richmond Fairgrounds Raceway, February 20th. The Miller High Life 500. Richard Petty in the famous number 43 STP Pontiac, leading 207 of 400 laps and pulling away from the field in exactly the kind of dominant fashion that made other crew chiefs pull their hair out. He took the win, his 198th career victory, and the crowd erupted. Victory Lane was a celebration. The wax was already gone, vaporized somewhere around lap 12, leaving nothing behind but extra horsepower and a clean engine that measured exactly 358 cubic inches if anyone cared to check. Nobody checked. The post-race inspection was routine. Weight, height, body template. Standard stuff. The engine sat untouched. Another perfect execution of Maurice's melting miracle. But here's where the story turns. And this is the part that gets me every single time I think about it. The wax trick wasn't what got them caught. What got them caught was a tire. A left side tire that looked just a hair too big. Just a fraction outside of what was supposed to be on that car. Dick Beattie, NASCAR's technical director at the time, was one of those officials with the kind of eye that notices things most people walk right past. He'd been watching the 43 car carefully for some time, and something about those left side tires didn't sit right. By NASCAR's own accounting, the infraction was relatively minor, worth perhaps 1/10 of a second per lap. Practically nothing. But it gave Beattie and his team the justification they needed to dig deeper. The inspection that followed was unlike anything NASCAR had conducted to that point. They didn't just measure the exterior of the car. They disassembled the engine, piece by piece, component by component. Bore, stroke, rod length, compression height. Every measurement recorded, every number compared to what the rulebook said it should be. And when they put it all together, the displacement came back at 373 cubic inches. Not 358. Not close to 358. A full 15 cubic inches over the legal limit. An engine that had passed pre-race inspection just 48 hours earlier at a legal 358 was now measuring 373 in post-race teardown. The math didn't add up. Nothing added up. Maurice tried to explain it away. Measurement errors. Race damage. Carbon buildup affecting chamber volumes. He was smooth about it, calm and matter-of-fact in the way that only someone who has rehearsed their cover story truly can be. But NASCAR kept digging. They put a borescope inside the combustion chambers and started looking at the walls, the valve pockets, the surfaces that a running engine touches hundreds of times per second. And in the pockets of a couple of valves they found it. Tiny. Microscopic. But there. Traces of wax residue that hadn't quite made it out through the exhaust. A few droplets of paraffin changed everything. Bill France Jr. flew down personally to deal with the situation. This wasn't something you delegated. The Pettys were NASCAR royalty, and you couldn't handle royalty with a form letter and a phone call. What followed were conversations that, by all accounts, were tense and direct. France understood the culture. He knew that teams pushed rules. He knew that creative engineering was part of the sport's DNA. But this was different. This was systematic, deliberate, and sophisticated enough to suggest it had been happening for a long time. The penalties came down. A $35,000 fine for petty enterprises, which in 2024 dollars represents something close to $105,000. Richard lost 104 championship points, though he was allowed to keep the win because NASCAR's rulebook at the time was murkier on that specific point than France would have liked. Maurice was suspended from crew chief duties for the remainder of the Richmond event and the subsequent race at Rockingham. By the standards of today's NASCAR, where penalties can strip entire seasons of points and ban personnel for years, it might sound light. But in 1983, it was a thunderclap. The message was heard loud and clear throughout every garage in the sport. More importantly, and this is the lasting consequence that defines the true impact of the wax trick, NASCAR fundamentally changed how it conducted technical inspections. Random post-race displacement checks became standard procedure. Engines would now be measured at operating temperature as well as cold. A paper trail was required for every measurement taken at every event. More officials were hired and trained specifically for engine inspection. The window of opportunity that Maurice Petty had exploited so brilliantly was closed, locked, and the key was thrown away. The reaction from around the motorsport world was fascinating. Some people were outraged. Here was the most famous team in the sport's history cheating in a premeditated, calculated, sophisticated way. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a gray area. It was a deliberate attempt to circumvent the rules that every other team was playing by. That felt like a betrayal to a lot of fans who had built their love of the sport around Richard Petty's heroic, honest image. But others, particularly the engineers and mechanics and crew chiefs who understood what Maurice had actually done, reacted differently. Smokey Yunick, the legendary mechanic whose own reputation for creative rule bending was encyclopedic, called it brilliant. He said he'd thought of something similar himself but assumed NASCAR would catch on immediately. He said Maurice had something he lacked, and that thing was nerve. Junior Johnson, once he finally understood what had been done, reportedly nodded slowly and said nothing for a long moment. That silence said more than words could. Other teams immediately started experimenting with variations on the concept. If wax worked, what about dry ice? What about materials with different melting points? What about compounds that could expand rather than contract with heat? The cat-and-mouse game that defines the relationship between racing teams and sanctioning bodies accelerated dramatically. Teams got creative. NASCAR got more sophisticated. And the sport emerged from the episode fundamentally different from how it had entered. Now, let's talk about the technical side of why this worked so effectively, because I think this is where the real genius lives. The physics of what Maurice accomplished are actually more elegant than they first appear. Displacement is calculated by measuring bore and stroke, the cylinder's diameter and the piston's travel distance, and multiplying by the number of cylinders. A standard NASCAR engine of that era ran a bore of approximately 4.185 inches and a stroke of 3.25 inches across 8 cylinders, producing 358 cubic inches. Simple math. Hard limit. But what Maurice understood was that displacement, as measured by the pump method NASCAR used during inspections, is really just a measurement of volume. And volume can be manipulated by anything that occupies space, including wax. When the wax filled portions of the combustion chambers, it physically reduced the volume that the measurement pump could detect. The bore and stroke hadn't changed. The pistons, rods, and crankshaft were exactly what they were supposed to be. But the effective volume above the piston at top dead center was smaller because the wax was sitting there, occupying space, pretending to be engine metal. The inspector's pump couldn't tell the difference between combustion chamber wall and wax. It just measured what was there. Once the wax melted and evacuated, that volume was restored. The space above the piston opened up. More air and fuel could be inducted per cycle. Each combustion event released more energy. The engine breathed deeper, pulled harder, and delivered more power to the rear wheels. It was, in the most literal sense, an engine that grew during the race. The thermodynamics had an additional benefit that Maurice may or may not have anticipated. During the warm-up phase, before the wax fully melted, it would act as a temporary insulator inside the combustion chambers. This actually helped the engine reach operating temperature faster and more evenly than it otherwise might. As the wax transitioned from solid to liquid, it would briefly enrich the combustion mixture, since the paraffin itself contains significant hydrocarbon content. Think of it as a tiny, timed fuel injection event built into the engine's chemistry. Every wax molecule that burned contributed energy. Nothing was wasted. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at this story. The wax trick didn't exist in isolation. It was one piece of a much larger engineering philosophy at Petty Enterprises, one that viewed every component of a race car as a variable rather than a constant. While the wax was handling displacement, other innovations were working on aerodynamics, fuel delivery, suspension geometry, and tire behavior. The wax was hidden inside all of that activity, camouflaged by a dozen other things that NASCAR officials were already watching for. It was like a magician using misdirection. While everyone was looking at one hand, the other hand was doing something entirely different. This is where the competitive intelligence aspect gets genuinely interesting. The Pettys weren't just trying to cheat. They were managing information. They knew that if their car was dramatically faster than everyone else's, questions would be asked. So they engineered performance advantages across multiple systems, each one providing a small, explainable gain that wouldn't trigger deep scrutiny on its own. The left side tires that ultimately drew attention? Those provided a handling advantage that made the car more consistent, which helped Richard preserve tires and maintain pace later in races. The fuel additives they experimented with helped combustion efficiency. The chassis geometry they ran was optimized in ways that most competitors hadn't explored yet. Any one of these things, standing alone, looked like smart engineering. Together, they created a package that was nearly unbeatable. The wax was the crown jewel, the hidden ace, the thing that, if everything else was roughly equal, ensured that the 43 car could dig deep in the final 100 miles and find something that nobody else had. Let's take a moment to consider the human element here, because I think we sometimes reduce these stories to pure technical analysis and forget that real people were carrying enormous psychological weight. Imagine being the crew member whose job it was to install the wax before every race. The pressure of getting every measurement exactly right, of knowing that a slightly generous hand in one cylinder could end your season before it started, of understanding that your work might come under intense scrutiny from people specifically trained to find exactly what you were hiding. You'd be carrying that all week. You'd be carrying it through qualifying, through practice, through the pre-race inspection. And then, when the car disappeared into the first turn and the engine started climbing toward operating temperature, you'd be waiting, counting laps in your head, knowing that somewhere around lap 12 or 15, the secret would be gone and you could finally breathe again. That's a particular kind of pressure. And the fact that it was maintained, apparently across multiple seasons and multiple events, speaks to the discipline and commitment that defined Petty Enterprises at its peak. Richard Petty's own role in all of this is one of the great unanswered questions. He maintained publicly and consistently that he simply drove what Maurice built and didn't involve himself in the technical details. And look, there's something to that. Drivers in that era often had a deliberate ignorance of certain mechanical particulars, particularly ones that fell into legally ambiguous territory. What you don't know, you can't accidentally reveal under questioning. But here's the thing. Drivers in 1983 were intimately connected to their machines in a way that modern drivers sometimes aren't. They felt every vibration, heard every change in exhaust note, noticed every shift in the car's behavior. And an engine that was progressively gaining power over the first 15 laps of a race would produce a very specific and noticeable change in feel. The accelerator would become more responsive. The straightaway speed would build. The car would begin to feel increasingly alive beneath you. If Richard Petty drove those races and felt none of that, he had the least sensitive seat in the history of professional motorsport. The far more likely interpretation is that he knew exactly what was happening and understood that plausible deniability was part of the deal. He was the face. Maurice was the brain. And some things were better left unspoken between brothers. What's undeniable is that Richard's driving ability was entirely real, regardless of what was under the hood. 7 championships don't happen through engineering alone. The man could wheel a race car with a precision and intelligence that few drivers in history have matched. But the wax gave that talent an amplifier. It took a great driver and put him in a car that could win even when circumstances weren't ideal. Now, some people look at the $35,000 fine and the 104 points penalty and argue that NASCAR went easy on the Pettys because of who they were. And there's probably some truth to that. The politics of sanctioned racing are never truly separate from its personalities. Richard Petty was the sport's greatest ambassador at a time when NASCAR was still fighting for mainstream legitimacy. You don't alienate your biggest star over a cylinder full of wax if you can avoid it. The penalties were designed to be firm enough to deter repetition and signal seriousness, but not so devastating that they destroyed a franchise essential to the sport's growth. But here's the counterargument, and I think it's worth making clearly. The changes to NASCAR's inspection protocol that came out of this incident were not gentle or symbolic. They were structural and permanent. Random post-race engine checks, hot displacement testing, sealed engines between sessions, expanded inspector training and staffing. These reforms cost money and added complexity to every race weekend. They were not the actions of a sanctioning body that was going easy on anyone. They were the actions of an organization that had just realized how badly it had been exposed and was determined to make sure it never happened again. The fine and points might have been politically moderated. The rule changes were not. Junior Johnson, in discussing the incident years later, made an observation that I find genuinely profound. He said that what Maurice did wasn't just about cheating. It was about seeing the rule from a different angle than anyone else. He said that most people read a rule and figure out how to comply with it. Maurice read a rule and figured out what it was actually measuring, and then found a way to satisfy the measurement without satisfying the spirit. That distinction between the letter of a rule and its measurement mechanism is where all great technical innovation in motorsport lives. It's the same thinking that produced ground effect aerodynamics in Formula One, the same thinking behind double diffusers and flexible wings and mass dampers. Find what's actually being measured. Then optimize for the measurement rather than the intent. The wax trick was the blue-collar American version of that same intellectual process. No supercomputers, no computational fluid dynamic, no team of PhD engineers, just one guy in a machine shop, looking at a paraffin candle and asking himself a very specific question. This is also where it gets really interesting from a historical perspective. The 1983 incident sits at a genuine inflection point in NASCAR's development as a sport. The years before it were defined by individual creativity and garage ingenuity. The years after it were increasingly defined by standardization, corporate involvement, and institutional oversight. The wax trick is almost a perfect dividing line between two eras of American racing. Before the wax, NASCAR was a sport where a smart mechanic with a good idea could change the competitive order. After the wax, that world began its slow fade toward the heavily regulated, deeply structured modern series we watch today. Some people mourn that transition. They'll tell you that what NASCAR lost in the years after 1983 was the soul of what made it great. The creativity, the improvisation, the sense that any given Sunday could be upended by something nobody had thought of yet. And there's genuine sadness in that perspective. The romance of the Wild West garage era was real, and it was worth preserving. But others point out that the professionalization of NASCAR's technical oversight is exactly what allowed the sport to grow into a billion-dollar enterprise with genuine mainstream credibility. That the stories that make us nostalgic for the wax trick era are also stories of fundamental unfairness, where teams with more creative cheaters beat teams with better legitimate engineering. The playing field that emerged from stricter enforcement was more level, even if it was less romantic. Both things are true simultaneously. The wax trick was beautiful and it was wrong. And sports that last long enough eventually have to choose order over beauty, even when order is less interesting. Let's dig into something that rarely gets discussed when people tell this story, which is the broader ecosystem of technical creativity that surrounded the wax trick. Because Maurice Petty didn't develop this approach in isolation. He was working in a culture that had been developing and refining technical deception for decades, and understanding that culture is essential to understanding why this particular trick was possible and why it worked for as long as it apparently did. NASCAR's roots are famously tied to moonshine runners, men who modified their vehicles for performance not as a hobby but as a survival strategy. Speed wasn't just exciting. It was the difference between freedom and a federal conviction. That mentality, the idea that mechanical ingenuity in the service of winning was both legitimate and admirable regardless of what the rules said, became hardwired into stock car racing's culture from its earliest days. The first NASCAR inspectors were dealing with cars that had hidden fuel tanks, weighted roll cages, and body panels made of materials that were definitely not what the rulebook specified. Cheating in NASCAR wasn't a corruption of the sport's values. In a twisted way, it was an expression of them. By the time we reach 1983, the techniques had become dramatically more sophisticated. Teams were using wind tunnels, though access was limited and expensive. Computer modeling was beginning to appear, though it was primitive by modern standards. But the core philosophy remained unchanged from the moonshine era. Find an advantage. Hide it. Keep winning until someone figures it out. Then find the next advantage. What Maurice did with the wax was sit at the pinnacle of this evolutionary process. He found an advantage that was genuinely invisible, not just hard to detect but physically self-erasing. The evidence didn't need to be hidden or destroyed after the fact because it destroyed itself as a natural consequence of how it worked. From a purely technical standpoint, that's a more elegant solution than anything else being done in NASCAR garages at the time. The acid-dipped body panels could be found if you weighed them carefully enough. The illegal fuel additives left chemical signatures. The hydraulic suspension systems had hardware that an inspector could discover. The wax left nothing. It was the perfect crime, at least until someone thought to look with a borescope at valve pockets in a torn-down engine. It's worth noting that the discovery itself was something of a fluke. If those left side tires hadn't been fractionally oversized, if Dick Beattie's eye hadn't caught that detail in the chaos of Victory Lane, the post-race inspection almost certainly doesn't go beyond the standard checklist. The engine stays assembled. The wax residue stays unexamined. And we might be sitting here today without knowing this story at all, still wondering why Richard Petty's cars seemed to have a mysterious extra gear that appeared around lap 15 of every race. That thought is genuinely haunting if you sit with it long enough. How many other schemes ran their full course and were simply never discovered? How many innovations were so perfectly executed that they came and went without leaving a single trace in the official record? The ones we know about are the ones that got caught. And the ones that got caught were, almost by definition, the slightly imperfect ones. The truly perfect technical deceptions in NASCAR history are invisible to us because they worked exactly as designed. This should give you a very different perspective on the official historical record of the sport. Now let's talk about the engineering legacy, because this is where the story connects to something much larger than one team's scheme in 1983. The principles that Maurice Petty applied, using phase-change materials to manipulate measured quantities temporarily, became a topic of serious academic interest after the incident became public. Materials scientists and thermodynamic engineers were genuinely fascinated by the conceptual approach, even as they condemned its application. Several papers were written in academic journals about phase-change materials in precision measurement contexts, directly referencing or inspired by the NASCAR incident. Phase-change materials, or PCMs as they're known in engineering, are now used in sophisticated legitimate applications ranging from thermal management in electronics to temperature regulation in textiles to building insulation systems. The properties that made paraffin wax useful in a 1983 NASCAR engine, its predictable phase transition temperature, its energy absorption during melting, its relatively clean thermal behavior, are the same properties that make PCMs valuable in modern engineering. Maurice Petty was, accidentally or not, working with concepts that would become significant research areas decades later. I want to be clear that I'm not suggesting his work contributed to those developments in any direct way. He was a mechanic trying to win a race, not a researcher trying to advance materials science. But it's a remarkable illustration of how insights can exist across wildly different contexts. The man stuffing wax into a racing engine in Level Cross, North Carolina, was manipulating the same fundamental physics that now manages heat in smartphones and regulates temperature in hospital cooling systems. The inspection methodology changes that NASCAR implemented after 1983 also had a lasting technical legacy. The requirement for hot displacement testing, checking engine volume at operating temperature rather than just cold, seems obvious in retrospect. Of course you should check the engine in the conditions under which it actually runs. But it wasn't standard practice before the wax incident. Maurice Petty's scheme forced NASCAR to think more rigorously about what it was actually measuring and under what conditions. That's a more sophisticated inspection philosophy, and it cascaded into improvements across multiple areas of technical oversight. The borescope inspection that discovered the wax residue became a standard post-race tool. Today, NASCAR officials use equipment that would be unrecognizable to Dick Beattie's 1983 inspection team. Laser measurement systems, electronic displacement gauges, digital imaging of internal engine surfaces. All of it exists because of an ongoing arms race between technical innovation and regulatory oversight that the wax trick accelerated significantly. Let's talk about the competitive landscape of 1983 specifically, because I think context matters enormously here. Junior Johnson's teams, running cars for Darrell Waltrip and others, were genuinely the dominant force of that era. They had resources, talent, and their own considerable appetite for creative engineering. The Pettys weren't the only ones pushing limit. They were just the ones who got caught in a particularly dramatic way. The dynamic between these competing organizations was essentially a technology race conducted in parallel with the actual races on the track. Every advantage one team found compelled the others to respond. Every response created new pressure to find the next advantage. The wax trick, in this context, was the Pettys' answer to horsepower deficits they were experiencing in certain conditions. Their engines were competitive but not dominant without it. With it, they could match or exceed anyone on the straightaways regardless of displacement advantages the competition might have found through more conventional means. It leveled a playing field that the Pettys felt was already tilted, though whether that perception was accurate is something historians still debate. Richard Petty's driving statistics from the period when the wax was presumably in use paint an interesting picture. His win rate during certain stretches of 1982 and 1983 exceeded what his equipment should have produced based on practice and qualifying speed. The cars were often fast but not consistently the fastest in qualifying, when the engine would presumably still be running at 358 cubic inches with the wax intact and cold. They would then perform significantly better in races, particularly in the later stages, than their qualifying position would predict. This pattern, fast in races, average in qualifying, is exactly what you'd expect from an engine running the wax scheme. The cold engine with wax installed produces adequate power at 358 cubic inches. The hot engine with wax melted produces superior power at 373. Qualifying rewards cold engine performance. Races reward hot engine performance. It's right there in the numbers if you know what to look for. The broader question of how many wins this scheme contributed to will never have a definitive answer. Richard's total of 200 career victories is one of sport's great records, achieved over a quarter-century of racing against the best competition of multiple generations. The wax trick, even if it was used across dozens of races, operated within a career that was built on genuine talent, enormous dedication, and a level of commitment to excellence that went far beyond any single technical innovation. The 200 wins are real. The question is just how the accounting shakes out when you factor in advantages that were later ruled illegal. Here's the thing about how we should actually think about the wax trick. Not as a simple story of cheating caught and punished, but as a case study in competitive intelligence and risk management. Because when you strip away the moral dimension for a moment and just look at the decision tree, what Maurice Petty built was a remarkably sophisticated risk management structure. Consider the risk profile of the scheme. The potential upside was enormous. 30 extra horsepower across an entire racing season, appearing invisibly after the first 15 laps of every event, with no detectable evidence after the race. Even a handful of wins per season generated prize money and sponsorship bonuses that dwarfed any conceivable fine. In pure financial terms, even getting caught was manageable if you won enough races before discovery. The $35,000 fine that eventually came down was significant by 1983 standards, but it was recoverable within a single race win's worth of prize money and bonuses. The risk of discovery seemed genuinely low. NASCAR wasn't checking displacement post-race routinely. The evidence self-destructed during the race. The only way to find it was to know what you were looking for and have a specific reason to tear the engine down completely. As long as nothing else drew attention, the wax could run indefinitely. The parallel with security systems is worth making explicit. The best security vulnerabilities are the ones where the attacker can operate without triggering any alerts, where the evidence of their activity disappears naturally, and where discovery requires specific knowledge that the defender doesn't yet possess. The wax checked all three boxes. What ultimately brought it down wasn't the scheme itself, but an unrelated operational error. Those oversized left side tires were the vulnerability, the mistake that gave Beatty his opening. In risk management terms, it wasn't the main scheme that failed. It was an ancillary operation that created unexpected exposure. The lesson is almost painfully clear in retrospect. You can run the most sophisticated deception in the world, but if you're also running a dozen smaller operations without the same level of care, one of them will eventually create the crack that unravels everything. Modern business strategy literature often references exactly this dynamic. Companies that are careful about their primary competitive practices but sloppy about peripheral activities create exactly the kind of exposure that the Pettys experienced. The tire was their peripheral activity. The wax was their core strategy. And the peripheral activity destroyed the core strategy by creating the very scrutiny that found it. Now let's look at this from another angle entirely. The engineering philosophy perspective. What does it say about how problems should be approached? I think the wax trick teaches us something genuinely valuable about the nature of constraints and creativity. The constraint here was the 358 cubic inch displacement limit. Every other team responded to that constraint by trying to extract maximum performance from within it. They optimized combustion efficiency. They developed better fuel mixtures. They experimented with cam profiles and exhaust tuning. All of that was working within the constraint, accepting it as a fixed boundary and trying to do the best possible job inside it. Maurice looked at the constraint differently. He didn't ask how do we get the most power from 358 cubic inches. He asked whether 358 cubic inches was actually a fixed number at all points in time. And the answer, when he thought it through, was no. It was only fixed at the moment of measurement. Before and after that moment, the engine could be whatever you made it. The constraint existed only in the instant of inspection. That kind of thinking, questioning whether a constraint is actually as fixed as it appears, is the foundation of most significant innovation. It's not unique to cheating or to racing. It's how genuinely transformative ideas happen across every field of human endeavor. The Wright brothers didn't ask how to make a better hot air balloon. They questioned whether balloons were actually the right approach to flight. Steve Jobs didn't ask how to make a better MP3 player. He questioned whether the device and the music distribution system should be separate things at all. Maurice Petty didn't ask how to extract more power from 358 cubic inches. He questioned whether 358 cubic inches had to be the number for the entire duration of a race event. The answer he found was wrong by the rules. But the thinking process that led him there was exactly the kind of lateral creativity that drives genuine breakthroughs. Engineering schools teach case studies like this precisely because the thinking methodology transcends the specific application. You study the wax trick not to learn how to cheat in NASCAR, but to learn how to look at constraints from unusual angles. Let's bring in some numbers that help illustrate just how significant this advantage was in real-world performance terms. In 1983, the difference between winning the Daytona 500 and finishing fifth was approximately 1.2 seconds per lap over a 200-lap race. That gap accumulated to a total time difference of about 4 minutes over the full event. The power advantage conferred by 15 extra cubic inches of displacement translates, using period-accurate aerodynamic and mechanical data, to approximately 0.8 seconds per lap on a 1-mile oval. That's not the entire margin between first and fifth, but it's the majority of it. An engine that was at the 25th percentile of the competitive field in terms of outright power could become a legitimate contender if it could access the equivalent of 15 extra cubic inches in the race conditions that mattered most. Put differently, the wax didn't just help good cars win. It could help average cars beat good ones. That's a fundamentally different kind of competitive advantage from the normal incremental gains that legitimate development provide. Normal development moves you from 90th percentile to 95th percentile performance. The wax moved you from 50th percentile to 90th percentile. The magnitude of that shift is almost impossible to overstate in a sport where tenths of a second define careers. The fuel economy implications are also worth noting. A larger displacement engine, all else being equal, burns more fuel per unit time at a given power output. This should have created a detectable fuel mileage discrepancy. The Petty cars should have been making more pit stops for fuel than cars running genuinely legal 358 cubic inch engines, or they should have been running leaner mixtures to compensate. The fact that this wasn't noticed, or at least wasn't acted upon, suggests either that the discrepancy was within normal variation or that it was masked by other factors in the Petty team's operational approach. This is another area where the full story remains somewhat opaque, because the people who knew the details are no longer alive to tell them. What we can say with confidence is that the scheme worked at the highest levels of professional motorsport competition for a meaningful period of time. It was sophisticated enough to pass routine inspection, robust enough to survive the thermal and mechanical stresses of race conditions, and discreet enough to leave no detectable evidence in post-race examination. The fact that it was ultimately discovered is almost incidental to the main story. The main story is that it worked, repeatedly, against the best competition in American motorsport. I want to take a moment to address something that sometimes comes up when this story gets told. The argument that because everyone was cheating, what the Pettys did was essentially equivalent to what everyone else was doing and therefore not particularly egregious. This is worth engaging with seriously because it's a real perspective held by real people in the motorsport community, not just a convenient excuse. It's true that the 1983 NASCAR field included numerous teams engaged in various forms of rule circumvention. Fuel additives that bordered on illegal, body modifications that pushed templates to their absolute limit, weight distribution tricks that exploited measurement ambiguities. In that environment, strict moral absolutism about rule compliance was somewhat naive. Every team was doing something that tested the limit. But there's a meaningful distinction between testing limits and systematically defeating the measurement mechanism itself. Most forms of technical boundary pushing in NASCAR involved finding gray areas in the rules, places where the regulation was ambiguous or where the specific parameter being regulated was difficult to measure precisely. The wax trick didn't operate in a gray area. The displacement limit was explicitly stated, precisely measurable, and universally understood. What the wax did was defeat the measurement process while complying with its outcome. That's a different category of action from exploiting a regulatory ambiguity, and it's worth recognizing that distinction even if you have significant sympathy for the competitive culture that produced it. The long shadow of this story extends far beyond the specific incident and into questions about how we preserve the balance between creative innovation and competitive fairness in any regulated competition. This tension isn't unique to motorsport. It appears in every arena where rules govern competition and where the stakes are high enough to make rule testing worthwhile. Professional cycling has its doping scandals. Finance has its accounting innovations that satisfy the letter of regulations while defeating their purpose. Professional baseball had its sign-stealing controversies. The technology industry has its regulatory arbitrage strategies that comply with the text of laws while circumventing their intent. In every case, the underlying dynamic is identical to what Maurice Petty was doing. Find what's actually being measured. Satisfy the measurement. Optimize the reality. The sophistication of the tools changes across different fields, but the conceptual approach is the same. And the regulatory response is also always the same. Catch the specific violation. Close that specific loophole. Then watch for the next iteration. This is why the story of the wax trick is genuinely educational beyond its entertainment value. It illuminates a fundamental aspect of how competition works when rules are involved. Rules create boundaries. Boundaries create incentives to find the edges. Finding the edges creates competitive advantages. Competitive advantages invite discovery. Discovery leads to new rules. New rules create new boundaries. And the cycle continues indefinitely. NASCAR in 2024 is the direct product of every iteration of that cycle since the sport's founding. The wax trick accelerated one particularly important iteration. It forced the sport to think more carefully about what it was actually trying to regulate, how it was measuring compliance, and what conditions mattered for those measurements to be valid. Maurice Petty passed away in 2020 at age 81. His obituaries and remembrances were respectful and warm, focusing on his decades of engine-building excellence and his central role in creating the most successful team in NASCAR's formative era. The wax trick was mentioned, sometimes with a hint of scandal, sometimes with barely concealed admiration. He never gave a full and complete account of how the scheme worked, how long it ran, or what other innovations existed in the same category. He took those details to his grave with the composure of someone who had decided long ago that some stories are better left incomplete. Richard Petty, still alive and still attending races into his 80s, maintains to this day that his job was driving and Maurice's job was building. Whatever Maurice built, Richard drove. That division of responsibility, so cleanly stated, is impossible to fully believe but equally impossible to disprove. It's the perfect alibi, not because it's necessarily false, but because it might actually be true. And truth and perfect alibi are not always distinguishable from the outside. The level cross shops where all of this happened are now part of the Petty Museum complex. Historic cars sit in climate-controlled display spaces, including several from the era when the wax was presumably being used. The dynamometer cell where Maurice tested those engines still exists as part of the facility. If those concrete walls could speak, the stories would fill volumes. As it is, they're silent, holding the specific frequencies of engines run to destruction in the service of speed and secret. What remains, beyond the museum and the record books and the regulatory changes, is the story itself. And stories about human ingenuity, about the audacity to try something that sounds ridiculous, about the gap between simple ideas and powerful outcomes, these stories endure because they speak to something real in human experience. We are a species that looks at limitations and asks whether they're actually as fixed as they appear. We are a species that sees materials and asks whether they can do things they haven't done before. We are a species that finds rules and immediately begins looking for the space between their letter and their intent. Maurice Petty was all of that, concentrated into one quiet, brilliant, slightly rule-averse man working nights in a North Carolina engine shop with a block of paraffin wax and an idea that everyone else would have dismissed as too stupid to work. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Not the cheating part, though that's real and it matters. What I want you to take away is this. The most powerful innovations aren't always the most complex ones. The wax trick required no advanced technology, no exotic materials, no sophisticated engineering expertise beyond a thorough understanding of thermodynamics and NASCAR's inspection procedures. It required observation, the ability to see what others weren't seeing. It required imagination, the ability to ask a question that nobody else was asking. And it required nerve, the willingness to act on an answer that sounded insane until you thought it all the way through. The numbers tell the final story. 15 cubic inches, 25 to 30 horsepower. One idea that cost $3 in materials. A scheme that survived multiple race seasons undetected. A fine of $35,000. 104 championship points. And fundamental changes to how the most successful motorsport series in American history conducts its technical inspections. From a candle's worth of wax came consequences that reshaped an entire sport. That's not a story about cheating. That's a story about leverage. About finding the one point where a small force creates an enormous effect. About understanding systems deeply enough to find the place where they can be changed with minimal intervention. Maurice Petty found that place, exploited it brilliantly, and changed his sport forever, even though getting caught was never part of the plan. The wax is gone. The evidence dissolved into exhaust gases over late race laps at Richmond and Rockingham and a dozen other tracks. But the idea remains. The idea that a constraint is only as fixed as the moment you're measuring it. The idea that simple solutions can beat complex problems. The idea that sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the thing nobody thought to look for because it sounded too stupid to work. In racing, as in everything else, the line between stupid and genius runs right through the place where an idea that sounds wrong turns out to be right. Maurice Petty found that line and drove a wax-filled engine straight across it. If you want more stories about the hidden engineering, the backroom innovations, and the moments of audacious creativity that actually shaped motorsport history, not the sanitized press release version but the real story, then you're in exactly the right place. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment telling me which era of NASCAR you think produced the most creative technical thinking, and let's keep digging into the history that the official record doesn't always want to tell. We'll see you in the next one. What if I told you that an 18-year-old kid from Tennessee, working alone in a garage with nothing but a welder and some scrap steel tubing, invented something so effective that professional racers with $20,000 worth of suspension equipment couldn't believe what they were seeing? We're talking about a setup that cost $55 total. $55 that produced 1.32 60-foot times. The kind of launch that snaps your head back so hard your brain needs a moment to catch up with your body. The kind of numbers that professional drag racers were spending entire racing budgets chasing. And a teenager beat them all with material you could find at a scrap yard. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about suspension geometry and drag racing history. If you're someone who loves the engineering stories behind motorsport innovations and wants to understand how one simple idea changed drag racing forever, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, here's the thing. Before we get into how this invention worked and why it was so revolutionary, we need to talk about the world it was born into. Because context matters here. A lot. The drag racing scene of the early 1970s was brutal in a specific way that doesn't get talked about enough. It wasn't just competitive. It was financially stratified in a way that felt almost designed to keep regular people out. If you showed up to a serious drag strip with a Leaf spring car, you basically had a target on your back. The established racing community had already decided what you were, and what you were was slow. Or at least slower than the guys with the expensive setups. And for a while they were right. Picture it. It's 1975. You're standing at a drag strip somewhere in Tennessee. The air is thick with that particular combination of tire smoke, racing fuel, and summer heat that anyone who's ever spent a Saturday at a track will immediately recognize in their memory. In one lane, there's a guy with a purpose-built race car. Tubular chassis, a 4-link rear suspension that took a professional shop weeks to fabricate, coilovers that cost more individually than most people's monthly rent. This guy has maybe $20,000 invested in his rear suspension setup alone. Just the suspension. Not the engine, not the transmission, not the bodywork. Just the bits that connect the rear axle to the chassis. In the other lane, there's a kid. Beat-up Chevelle. Leaf springs hanging under the back exactly the way they came from the factory. No chrome, no fancy brackets, nothing that screams race car from 20 feet away. But if you look closer, and most people at that track didn't bother looking closer because they'd already written this car off, you'd notice something. There are these parallel bars running from the axle housing forward toward the frame. Simple, clean, almost primitive looking. The kind of thing you might not even notice unless you knew what you were looking for. The Christmas tree counts down. Both cars launch. And something happens that nobody in that crowd expected. The kid Chevelle plants those rear tires into the asphalt like they're magnetized to it and rockets forward with a violence that matches the purpose-built race car exactly. The guy with the expensive 4-link setup is in disbelief. He just got his doors blown off by a teenager with welded steel tubes that probably took an afternoon to build. And here's what makes this story genuinely extraordinary. It wasn't a fluke. It happened run after run after run. The consistency was as shocking as the speed. This is the story of how ladder bars revolutionized drag racing and became the greatest suspension equalizer in the history of the sport. But more than that, it's a story about what happens when someone refuses to accept the conventional wisdom that expensive is the only path to fast. It's about a teenager's intuitive understanding of physics outsmarting millions of dollars in professional racing development. And to really understand why it was so revolutionary, why it shocked an entire sport and permanently changed it, you have to understand what racers were dealing with before this invention showed up. Here's what most people don't realize about leaf spring suspension under hard acceleration. The problem isn't actually the springs themselves. Springs are doing exactly what springs are supposed to do. The problem is torque. When you hammer the throttle on a rear-wheel drive car, the pinion gear wants to climb the ring gear. That rotational force, that twisting energy has to go somewhere. And in a leaf spring car, it goes straight into the springs themselves. Under hard acceleration, those springs want to wrap up into an S shape. The more power you're making, the more violent that wrap-up becomes. And this is where everything falls apart. Because wrapped springs store energy unpredictably and release it unpredictably. Sometimes that stored energy releases into forward motion. Sometimes it turns into wheel hop. Sometimes it just spins the tires. You genuinely couldn't predict which one you'd get on any given run. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what were the solutions people were using? And here's where it gets really interesting because there were 3 options available, and they all had serious problems. Option 1 was slapper bars. Crude devices that bolted to the front spring eye and extended back under the axle. The theory was that when the axle rotated under acceleration, the slapper bar would hit a rubber snubber and plant the tires. In practice, they worked with all the consistency of a coin flip. You'd get a great launch one run and then spin the tires on the next run with identical conditions. Bracket racing, which is all about repeatable elapsed times, was essentially ruined by this inconsistency. Option 2 was bolt-on traction bars. These clamped to the leaf spring and were supposed to prevent spring wrap-up by making the spring rigid. The problem with this approach is fundamental and kind of obvious once you think about it. If you make your leaf spring rigid, it stops being a suspension. Every imperfection in the track surface, every tiny bump, every expansion joint, transmitted directly through the car. Your traction was marginally better in perfect conditions, but the car became nearly undrivable in anything less than perfect conditions. And they'd eventually crack your springs, which is a particularly cruel way to end a racing weekend. Option 3 was the nuclear option. You tore out the entire rear suspension and installed a proper 4-link setup. Cut off the spring perches. Weld in new mounting brackets. Fabricate or buy a complete 4-link kit. Install coilovers. Re-engineer the entire rear geometry of your car from scratch. You were looking at thousands of dollars in parts alone before you even started talking about labor. And once you committed to this path, your street car wasn't really a street car anymore. Those 4-link setups were brilliant for racing, but the ride quality on the street was absolutely savage. Every expansion joint felt like a personal attack. So the established wisdom was clear. You had exactly 3 options for dealing with leaf spring traction problems, and none of them were good if you were a regular person trying to race on a real-world budget. The professional racers and the chassis shops had everyone convinced that good traction required complex geometry, expensive components, and essentially surrendering your car to full race duty. There was no middle ground, they said. You either dealt with inconsistent launches, destroyed your suspension chasing a solution that didn't work, or you opened your wallet wide and converted to a full race setup. And then a teenager in Tennessee looked at his leaf spring Chevelle and thought, there has to be a better way. What's remarkable about this part of the story is the specific type of racing this kid was involved in. Bracket racing. And bracket racing context is crucial here, because bracket racing isn't about being the fastest car in the room. It's about being the most consistent car in the room. In bracket racing, you predial your predicted elapsed time before the run. You're not trying to beat your opponent on raw speed. You're trying to run as close to your predicted time as possible, while your opponent tries to do the same. Inconsistent launches weren't just annoying in this format. They were race-ending. Every time your car launched differently than the time before, you were losing. This teenager understood something that the established racing community had somehow managed to overlook, or perhaps understood but hadn't yet figured out how to solve affordably. The physics of the problem pointed directly at a specific solution. The problem was axle rotation, not spring flex, not suspension compliance, not any of the other variables people were chasing. The specific mechanical problem was the axle housing trying to rotate under acceleration, and the springs being asked to control that rotation while simultaneously supporting the car's weight and providing ride compliance. That was too many jobs for one component. The solution wasn't to make the springs do their job better. It was to give the rotation control job to a different component entirely. Here's the elegance of what he figured out. Instead of trying to prevent spring wrap-up by making the springs rigid, like traction bars did, instead of replacing the springs entirely, like forelinks did, he decided to work alongside the springs. Let the springs do what springs are genuinely good at: support the car's weight, provide vertical compliance, absorb road imperfections. But add a secondary system whose only responsibility was controlling rotation. A system that would allow the suspension to move freely up and down but would immediately and completely prevent the axle housing from rotating. The solution he came up with was two parallel bars, simple steel tubing, running from mounting points on the axle housing forward to mounting points on the frame. Each bar would pivot on both ends using rod ends, which are essentially heavy-duty ball joints. This pivoting action meant the bars could freely accommodate the vertical movement of the suspension. The wheels could go up and down exactly as they needed to. But because the bars were parallel and fixed at both ends, rotation of the axle housing was mechanically impossible. The moment the axle tried to rotate under hard acceleration, those bars transferred that rotational force directly into the chassis, instantly, without any stored energy, without any of the unpredictability of spring wrap-up. The geometry of the mounting points was where the real genius lived. By positioning the front mounting points at a specific height relative to the rear mounting points, you could control something called the instant center of the suspension. Now, the instant center sounds complicated, and in a four-link suspension system it absolutely can be, but here's an analogy that makes it click immediately. Think of a seesaw. The pivot point in the middle is the instant center. Where you put that pivot point determines how the forces on each end of the seesaw behave. Move the pivot point closer to one end and small movements on that end create big movements on the other end. The same principle applies to suspension geometry. The location of the instant center determines how weight transfers during acceleration, and weight transfer determines traction. In a properly configured ladder bar setup, the instant center sits roughly at the height of the car's center of gravity and slightly forward of the rear axle. This specific geometry causes the rear of the car to squat slightly on hard acceleration, pushing weight down onto the rear tires at the exact moment those tires need maximum grip to put power to the ground. It's a mechanical trick that mimics what expensive four-link setups accomplish with multiple adjustable mounting points, except it does it with fixed geometry and no adjustability whatsoever. And here's the counterintuitive thing about that lack of adjustability. For most applications, it was actually an advantage. A four-link suspension has multiple adjustment points, which means multiple opportunities to get the geometry wrong. And getting the geometry wrong on a four-link doesn't just mean slightly worse performance. It means dramatically worse performance. Racers and shops who didn't have deep experience with four-link geometry could spend months chasing a setup that actually put them further behind than stock leaf springs. Every adjustment point is also a failure point in terms of your knowledge and understanding. Ladder bars eliminated this problem completely. There was one geometry that worked well for most drag racing applications, and you either installed the bars at the right mounting locations or you didn't. The variables were drastically reduced, and reduced variables meant more consistent behavior. The construction itself was almost insultingly simple. Two pieces of steel tubing, typically 2 inches in diameter, sometimes 2.5. 4 rod ends to allow the pivoting action at each end of each bar. Steel plate brackets to mount the bars to the axle housing, usually just plate bent into a U-shape and welded onto the housing tube. Frame mounting points that could be as simple as tabs welded to the frame rails. That's the complete parts list. In 1975, quality rod ends and steel tubing would run you about $55 total. $35 if you sourced your materials economically. Any person with basic welding skills could build a complete set in an afternoon. Not a weekend. An afternoon. The installation guidelines were simple enough that they circulated through the racing community by word of mouth. Mount the front of the bars approximately 2 inches higher than the rear mounting point. Keep the bars as long as the car's geometry practically allows. Make sure they clear everything through the full range of suspension travel. Verify that nothing binds, nothing rubs, nothing restricts the suspension from moving freely. Then go to the track and run. No engineering degree. No complex geometry calculations. No sophisticated tools beyond the welder, a drill, and a tape measure. The barriers to entry were nearly zero. When this teenager first tested his creation, the results were immediate and dramatic. The rear tires didn't just grip better. They transformed. That sensation of launching a car that's previously been wheel spinning and hopping into a car that just bites and goes is something drivers describe with a kind of reverence. It's violent in the best possible way. The car goes from being something you're managing and coaxing to something that's just executing. Pure forward thrust, no drama. But the number that really told the story was the 60-foot time. Because 60-foot times don't lie and they don't get influenced by driver perception. For anyone less familiar with drag racing timing, here's why the 60-foot time matters so profoundly. It measures how long it takes to cover the first 60 feet from a standing start. That seems like a small piece of a quarter-mile run, but it tells you almost everything about a car's launch. Think of it like a rocket launch. The first moments of a rocket leaving the launch pad determine its trajectory for the entire flight. In drag racing, the first 60 feet determine the character of the entire run. A great 60-foot time means the car was planting power effectively from the very first instant. A poor 60-foot time means everything that happened after was playing catch-up. To put some concrete numbers around why this matters, a reasonably quick street car with decent traction might run 60-foot times in the 2.0 to 2.2 second range. A well-sorted performance street car might get into the 1.8s or 1.9s. Professional door slammer race cars with sophisticated 4-link suspensions and dedicated drag radials or slicks were running 1.3 to 1.4 second 60-foot times. These were cars with professional setups, professional tires, professional drivers, and thousands of dollars in suspension development. That was the benchmark for what serious performance looked like off the starting line. This teenager's ladder bar car, running on street tires, with $55 worth of welded steel tubing, was pulling 1.32 60-foot times. Not occasionally. Consistently. Run after run. Sit with that for a second. A Leaf spring car with stock-appearing suspension plus 2 parallel steel tubes was launching as hard as professional race cars with suspension setups costing 40 times as much. It's like showing up to a professional kitchen competition with a camp stove you bought at a gas station and producing a meal that beats the Michelin-starred chef. The established experts should not lose. But they did. Word traveled through the Tennessee racing community with the kind of speed that only exists when something genuinely unbelievable keeps proving itself to be true. Racers would show up at the track, see the ladder bars under this Chevelle, and some of them would laugh. Simple tubes. That's your trick? And then they'd watch the time slip come back at 1.32 60-foot. And the questions would start. What 4-link are you running? When they were told it wasn't a 4-link, the follow-up question was always the same. Then what is it? When the answer came back as just 2 bars welded to the axle housing and the frame, the response was predictable disbelief. because the evidence was right there on the time slip, but it contradicted everything the racing community thought they understood about performance suspension. The professional racing establishment's initial reaction to ladder bars is almost charming in retrospect. They dismissed it. Of course they did. Chassis builders and suspension engineers had spent years developing the four-link systems that were considered state-of-the-art. They'd made real innovations, real improvements over what came before. They understood anti-squat percentages and instant center calculations and geometry optimization. And this teenager with his welded tubes was contradicting their entire framework by simply doing it. The dismissal was partly defensive and partly genuine disbelief. How could something this simple compete with carefully engineered geometry? It went against the entire narrative that complexity equals performance. But here's what those experts were missing, and it's what makes the ladder bar story so instructive beyond just the racing world. A four-link suspension is theoretically superior to a ladder bar. Given perfect installation, perfect geometry, and a skilled tuner who genuinely understands the system, a four-link will edge out a ladder bar. The theory is sound. The engineering is real. But theory and practice are two very different things when you're talking about systems that require extensive expertise to tune correctly. A perfectly adjusted four-link beats a ladder bar. A poorly adjusted four-link, which describes the vast majority of four-links that amateur racers were actually running, loses to a ladder bar every single time. Ladder bars removed the tuner's skill from the equation. They provided one geometry that worked well for most applications, couldn't be adjusted incorrectly because they couldn't be adjusted at all, and delivered that geometry consistently regardless of who installed them or how much experience they had. You bolted them in, they worked, and they kept working the same way every time. For bracket racing especially, that consistency was worth more than the marginal theoretical improvement of a perfectly tuned four-link. In a sport where hundredths of a second separate winners from losers, consistent behavior is everything. Now let's get into the physics in a way that actually makes intuitive sense, because this is where it gets really interesting. When you accelerate hard in a rear-wheel drive car with leaf springs, you're not dealing with one force. You're dealing with several forces acting simultaneously, and the interaction between them is what makes predicting leaf spring behavior so difficult. There's torque trying to rotate the axle housing. There's weight transfer trying to compress the rear springs. There's the spring's natural resistance to deformation. And there's the geometric relationship between all the mounting points, which changes continuously as the suspension moves through its travel. Traditional leaf springs have what engineers call a floating instant center. As the springs compress and extend through their travel, the theoretical point around which they rotate is constantly moving. Not just moving a little, moving significantly. And because that point is moving, the behavior of the suspension under acceleration changes constantly too. A spring that's compressed from weight transfer behaves differently from a spring at ride height, which behaves differently from a spring that's extended. Each position creates different traction characteristics. This is why leaf spring cars were so inconsistent. The car that launched well on Monday's pass might not launch well on Wednesday's pass because track temperatures changed slightly and the springs compressed to a different point and the instant center moved. Ladder bars fixed the instant center. Not approximately. Mathematically. Those two parallel bars created a defined geometric relationship between the axle housing and the chassis that remained constant regardless of where the suspension was in its travel. The leaf springs were still present, still supporting the car's weight, still providing the vertical compliance that made the car drivable on the street. But they were completely relieved of any responsibility for managing rotational forces. They did their one job, the job they were designed for, while the ladder bars handled the acceleration forces with absolute precision and perfect consistency. The bar length mattered, but not in a complicated way. Longer bars meant less angular change as the suspension cycled through its range, which meant more consistent geometry across different ride heights and loading conditions. Shorter bars were necessary when packaging constraints made longer bars impractical. The typical installation used bars in the 32 to 36-inch range, which provided a good balance between geometric consistency and practical fitment under most production cars. The 2-inch height differential between front and rear mounting points was established through trial and error as the sweet spot that created the right instant center location for most drag racing applications. The brackets themselves were fabricated from 1/4-inch steel plate. Nothing exotic. The axle housing brackets were typically welded directly to the housing tubes, creating a connection that was absolutely rigid. The frame brackets could be welded on or bolted through the frame rails depending on the builder's preference and the specific application. Rod ends, also called Hemi joints, at each end of each bar provided two things: the pivoting action necessary for the suspension to move freely through its travel, and a degree of installation forgiveness that made the whole system easier to fit correctly in real-world garage conditions. The simplicity of the construction was genuinely part of the design's brilliance. Because any component you don't include is a component that can't fail. Any adjustment point you eliminate is an adjustment that can't be made incorrectly. Any specialized knowledge you make unnecessary is a barrier you've removed for the next person who wants to use the design. The ladder bar, reduced to its essential elements, is almost impossible to get wrong if you follow the basic guidelines, and getting it right delivers performance that shocked an entire sport. The first drag strips in Tennessee to see ladder bars consistently perform started generating stories that spread across state lines faster than any advertisement could have. Racers talk. That's one of the foundational truths of motorsport culture. When something works, especially when something works unexpectedly, the story travels. By late 1975, racers in neighboring states were asking about the bars under those Chevelles. By 1976, fabricators in several markets were building ladder bar kits to meet demand. The idea had escaped the garage and entered the wider racing consciousness. Performance shops recognized the commercial opportunity almost immediately. Companies like Lakewood Industries, Competition Engineering, and Calvert Racing saw a clear market signal. Racers wanted this product, the demand was real and growing, and the design was simple enough that producing quality bolt-in kits for popular applications was straightforward. These production versions brought refinements that made sense for a manufactured product. Adjustable front mounting points that allowed some geometric tuning for different applications. Polyurethane bushings as an alternative to rod ends for street-driven cars, offering better durability and reduced maintenance in daily use conditions. Detailed installation instructions that made the product accessible to people who didn't have the original inventor's intuitive understanding of the geometry. But look, here's what's striking about every single production version that came to market. The fundamental design was unchanged from what that teenager built in his garage. Two parallel bars, pivoting at both ends, connecting the axle housing to the frame. Every refinement was in materials and convenience. None of the refinements changed the underlying mechanical principle because the underlying mechanical principle was already correct. You don't improve perfection in its fundamental form. You just make it easier to access. The professional racing establishment's acknowledgement of ladder bars, when it finally came, was reluctant in the way that any establishment's acknowledgement of a challenger tends to be. By the late 1970s, the time slips weren't lying, and time slips are the ultimate authority in drag racing. Leaf spring cars with ladder bars were running elapsed times that put them firmly in serious competition with purpose-built race cars. Not just in bracket racing, where consistency is the metric, but in index classes and even some heads-up formats where raw performance matters. The governing bodies of organized drag racing, NHRA and IHRA, updated their rulebooks to specifically address ladder bars. The fact that they needed to address them in the rulebook was itself an acknowledgement that ladder bars were legitimate competitive equipment. Some of the most impressive validation came from the stock and super stock classes, where rules require cars to closely mirror their factory configuration. In these classes, racers are working within tight constraints about what modifications are permissible, and the competition is intense because everyone is operating under similar restrictions. Ladder bars, which could be argued to leave the leaf spring architecture intact while simply adding a supplementary control system, became a crucial legal advantage in these classes. Cars that ran ladder bars in stock and super stock were consistently better off the line than cars that didn't, and the rulebook writers had to decide whether to ban them or accept them. They accepted them, which was the right call because the innovation was real. The Caltra bar, introduced in the early 1980s, deserves a moment of discussion here because it represents an interesting evolution of the ladder bar concept. Rather than two parallel bars, the Caltra system used a single bar with a spring-loaded preload mechanism. The operating principle was similar, controlling axle rotation while allowing vertical movement, but the execution was different. It split the difference between a pure ladder bar and a traction bar in a way that offered advantages in specific applications, particularly for cars that saw significant street use. While technically distinct from true ladder bars, the Caltra bar's commercial success confirmed something important. The market for affordable, effective axle control systems was large and enthusiastic, and there was room for design variations that served different needs within that market. The circle track racing community's adoption of ladder bar principles extended the technology's influence beyond straight-line racing. In circle track applications, the challenge isn't launching from a dead stop. It's controlling the rear axle under hard acceleration coming out of corners, where the combined forces of acceleration and cornering create complex load cases. Ladder bars and ladder bar-inspired designs helped racers manage these loads more predictably, translating to better corner exit speeds and more consistent lap times. The off-road community found value in ladder bars for controlling axle movement during aggressive climbing and acceleration in unpredictable terrain. Even towing applications benefited from the basic principle when dealing with the rotational forces created by heavy trailer load. The financial dimension of the ladder bar revolution is worth examining carefully because it illuminates something important about how innovation can reshape an entire industry's economic landscape. A typical 4-link conversion in 1975 cost approximately $3,000 in parts alone before labor. A ladder bar setup using quality components cost $55 to $80 total, including everything. That price difference isn't just significant for an individual racer. When you multiply it across the thousands of racers who chose ladder bars instead of 4-links in the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, you're talking about an enormous amount of money that stayed in racers' pockets rather than going to chassis shops and suspension fabricators. Here's what most people don't realize about what that money meant for the sport. Money that stays in racers' pockets doesn't disappear from the motorsport economy. It gets redirected. Racers who saved $3,000 on suspension spent that money on engine development, on better tires, on more track time, on the entry fees to attend more events. The democratization of launch performance through affordable ladder bars actually expanded the overall racing economy by enabling more people to participate at a competitive level. When the barrier to entry drops, more people enter. More people entering means more events, more tracks, more aftermarket business, more of everything that makes a motorsport culture vibrant. The playing field effect was profound and immediate in bracket racing specifically. Bracket racing in the mid-1970s had a stratification problem that mirrored the broader social stratification of expensive hobbies. The racers with money for 4-link setups had a consistent performance advantage that was almost impossible to overcome without a similar investment. Ladder bars flattened that advantage overnight. Suddenly the guy with a bootstrap budget and a fabricated ladder bar setup was cutting 60-foot times that matched the guy with the full race setup. Now the competition was about driving skill and tuning knowledge and track preparation and all the things that should determine who wins a race, rather than who had more money to spend on suspension. This democratization wasn't just good for individual racers. It was good for the sport's identity. Drag racing has always carried the mythology of the common person competing against the establishment and winning on merit. Hot rodding culture is built on the idea that ingenuity and determination matter more than budget and pedigree. Ladder bars embodied that mythology perfectly. They were physical proof that the mythology was real, that a teenager with a welder could out-engineer the expensive alternative and produce results that shocked the professionals. That story resonated deeply with the culture, and it still does. Modern computer modeling and finite element analysis have done something interesting to the legacy of ladder bars. They've validated them. When engineers with sophisticated simulation tools analyze the geometry that teenagers stumbled upon through intuition and experimentation, they find that the basic mounting configuration he established is remarkably close to optimal for most drag racing applications. The front mounting point positioned roughly 2 inches above the rear mounting point, with bars in the 32 to 36-inch range, creates an instant center location that modern simulation identifies as effective for transferring weight to the rear tires during hard acceleration while maintaining straight-line stability. This is humbling in the best possible way. An 18-year-old kid with a tape measure and a welder figured out geometry that advanced engineering software confirms is nearly correct. He didn't have a computer. He didn't have a simulation tool. He didn't have an engineering degree or access to professional racing data. He had an intuitive understanding of how forces work, a willingness to try something nobody had tried before, and the specific focus that comes from being really tired of losing bracket races because your car wouldn't hook consistently. Necessity shaped the invention. Physics validated it decades later. The evolution of materials in ladder bar construction tells its own story about how the racing industry absorbed and refined the original concept. Early ladder bars were built from mild steel tubing because that was what was available and affordable. Modern performance versions use chromoly steel, which offers significantly higher strength-to-weight ratios. Some race-specific applications use aluminum components in non-critical areas to further reduce weight. High-end rod ends feature special coating treatments that dramatically extend service life under the contamination and abuse they experience in racing environments. Adjustable versions with multiple mounting positions allow racers to fine-tune the instant center location for specific applications, recovering some of the tunability advantage that 4-links have while maintaining the ladder bar's fundamental simplicity. But here's the crucial point that gets missed in discussions about modern refined ladder bars. All of these material and feature improvements are optimizations. They make good ladder bars into great ladder bars. They didn't make ladder bars possible. That happened with cheap mild steel tubing and basic rod ends in a Tennessee garage. Every fancy modern version is built on the same mechanical principle that the original designer identified. Control the rotation, free the vertical movement, fix the instant center. Everything else is refinement. The power levels that modern ladder bar setups handle would have been genuinely unimaginable in 1975. Cars producing over 2,000 horsepower successfully use ladder bar suspensions. Think about what 2,000 horsepower means in terms of rotational forces trying to wind up that rear axle. The forces are enormous, and modern ladder bars handle them with quality materials and proper construction. 7-second quarter-mile cars, vehicles covering the entire quarter mile in 7 seconds from a standing start, have used ladder bar-based suspension successfully. The fundamental design scales. It worked at 200 horsepower in 1975, and it works at 2,000 horsepower today, because the physics don't care about the power level. They care about the geometry and the structural integrity of the component. The parade of would-be ladder bar replacements that the aftermarket produced over the decades is worth documenting, because it tells a story about how the racing market responds to established solutions. Every few years throughout the 1980s and 1990s, a company would introduce a new traction device that promised to finally supersede the ladder bar. Split monolith systems, torque arm designs, multi-link hybrids, sophisticated adjustable systems with multiple geometry positions. Each one came with engineering arguments for why it was superior. Some of them were genuinely superior in specific, narrow applications. None of them offered the combination of simplicity, broad effectiveness, and affordability that made ladder bars universally adopted. Most of them are no longer in production. Ladder bars are still on every drag strip in the world. There's an engineering philosophy lesson embedded in the ladder bar story that's worth making explicit, because it applies far beyond suspension design. Engineers talk about the concept of appropriate complexity. The right solution to a problem isn't necessarily the most sophisticated solution. It's the solution that addresses the specific problem with the minimum necessary complexity. Unnecessary complexity adds cost. It adds potential failure points. It adds knowledge requirements that limit who can successfully implement the solution. It adds adjustment variables that create new opportunities for error. The best engineering solution is the one that solves the problem completely while minimizing all of these unnecessary additions. Ladder bars are a textbook example of appropriate complexity. The problem was precisely defined. Axle rotation under hard acceleration causing inconsistent launches. The solution addressed that specific problem directly and completely. Two bars that prevent rotation while allowing vertical movement. Nothing was added that didn't serve the specific problem. No adjustments that didn't need to be adjusted. No components that didn't have a defined function. The result was a solution so well matched to the problem that 50 years of engineering advancement haven't produced a fundamentally better answer for the specific application it was designed for. The patent situation around the original ladder bar design has an interesting effect on the industry that's worth considering. That Tennessee teenager never filed a patent on his design. Whether this was intentional or simply because filing a patent wasn't on an 18-year-old racer's radar, the result was that the fundamental ladder bar concept entered the public domain immediately. Any fabricator, any manufacturer, any individual could build and sell ladder bars without licensing fees or royalties. This absence of intellectual property barriers drove competition among manufacturers, which drove both innovation in refining the design and reduction in prices through market competition. By the time commercial ladder bar kits were widely available in the late 1970s, the pricing was accessible to virtually any serious racer. Compare this to a hypothetical world where the design had been patented and exclusively licensed. A single company controlling the intellectual property could have charged whatever the market would bear, potentially keeping ladder bars expensive enough that their democratizing effect on the sport would have been severely limited. The absence of a patent was, in this specific case, better for the sport and for the technology's adoption than the presence of one would have been. There's an irony in the fact that the teenager who could have made a fortune by filing a patent and licensing his design instead, by not filing, made a gift to an entire sport. The cultural impact of ladder bars within hot rodding and drag racing extends beyond the technical. They became a symbol. When you saw ladder bars under a car at the track, it communicated something specific about the car's owner. This person understands the physics. This person didn't just spend money. This person solved a problem. In a culture that genuinely respects ingenuity and street wisdom over credentials and spending power, that symbolic meaning mattered. Ladder bar cars had a specific reputation. They were serious. They were consistent. They were going to give you a real run regardless of what else was under the hood. The dual-purpose car concept that became enormously popular through the 1980s, vehicles that could drive to work during the week and genuinely compete at the track on weekends, was enabled in large part by ladder bars. Before ladder bars, Running competitive elapsed times at the track basically required a dedicated race car because the suspension modifications necessary for competitive performance made the car unsuitable for street use. Ladder bars changed that equation. You could drive your car to the grocery store, drive it to the track on Saturday, run competitive times, and drive it home. The compromise wasn't perfect. It rarely is. But it was acceptable in a way that none of the previous solutions had been. This enabled an entire generation of racers who couldn't afford dedicated race cars to participate in the sport at a competitive level. The economics of drag racing participation shifted meaningfully when you didn't have to maintain both a race car and a street car, or choose between having a competitive car and having a car you could actually use. Ladder bars weren't the only technology that made dual-purpose performance cars possible in the 1980s, but they were a crucial enabling component. They solved the traction problem without sacrificing street usability, and that combination was genuinely transformative for how many people could participate in organized drag racing. Looking at the broader drag racing landscape today, nearly 50 years after that first ladder bar was fabricated in Tennessee, the technology's ubiquity is remarkable. Walk through the pits at any drag strip anywhere in the country on any given weekend. Look at the Leaf Spring cars. The overwhelming majority of them will have ladder bars, not because the technology is new and exciting, not because there's aggressive marketing pushing them, because they work, they're affordable, and the racing community has had half a century to confirm that. A technology that earns that kind of sustained adoption across decades of continuous innovation in the surrounding sport isn't just a good product. It's a fundamental solution. The stories from racers who made the switch to ladder bars in the early years are remarkably consistent in their character. The reaction is almost always described the same way. The car just plants. The front description captures something real about what ladder bars do to the sensation of driving a car hard. Before ladder bars, launching a Leaf Spring car with serious power involved managing the car, feeling what the rear end was doing, making micro-adjustments, trying to coax the tires into hooking rather than spinning. With ladder bars, the launch becomes almost mechanical. The car does the same thing every time because the suspension is doing the same thing every time. For a driver accustomed to fighting the car off the line, the first launch with ladder bars can feel almost anticlimactic. The work that used to happen simply doesn't happen anymore. And here's something that rarely gets discussed about ladder bars: their effect on driver development. When a car is inconsistent, drivers develop instincts and reactions that are responses to that inconsistency. They become very good at reading unpredictable launches and compensating for them. When you put that same driver in a consistent car, those compensating instincts can actually work against them initially. The consistency that ladder bars provide forces drivers to develop better fundamentals because there's nothing to manage off the line. The car is going to do exactly what it does. Your job is to drive everything that happens after that first 60 feet. The community of fabricators who built their businesses around ladder bars represents another economic legacy of the original invention. Shops that started as general fabrication or performance shops in the late 1970s built specific expertise around installing and configuring ladder bars. That expertise expanded naturally into related areas: rear-end preparation, drive shaft work, chassis stiffening, complete car builds. The ladder bar created an entry point for a generation of fabricators who built careers around making Leaf Spring cars faster and more consistent. Many of the shops that are considered authorities on rear suspension preparation today trace their expertise back to early work with ladder bars. The instruction that flows from this story reaches beyond motorsport into broader questions about innovation and problem-solving that are relevant in almost any domain. The story of ladder bars asks you to consider where conventional wisdom comes from and whether the path from problem to solution always runs through complexity and expense. The professional racing establishment of the early 1970s wasn't wrong about four-link suspensions. They were genuinely better in theory. The mistake was the assumption that better in theory meant better for everyone in practice. An 18-year-old racer who couldn't afford the theoretically superior solution found a practically superior solution for the vast majority of applications. The lesson is that the best solution depends on who's using it, under what conditions, and with what resources. For anyone who has ever looked at an expensive, complicated solution to a problem they were facing and thought there must be a simpler way, the ladder bar story is validation that this instinct is worth following. Sometimes the simpler way doesn't exist. Sometimes the complexity is genuinely necessary. But sometimes, like with axle rotation control in drag racing, the simple way not only exists but actually outperforms the complex alternative when you account for real-world conditions of knowledge, resources, and consistency of implementation. Here's the thing about the teenager who built those first ladder bars. His name is obscure in most accounts of drag racing history. He didn't patent his invention. He didn't start a company. He didn't become famous. He just solved a problem that was bugging him and shared the solution with people around him, the way racers do. And yet, his invention has been used on probably millions of race cars over 50 years. It's in the pits at every major drag racing event. It's in the driveways of weekend racers across the country. It's in the engineering textbooks as an example of elegant mechanical problem solving. It changed the economic accessibility of competitive drag racing. It enabled a generation of dual-purpose performance cars. And it did all of this because one person refused to accept that expensive was the only path to fast. Every 1.32 60-foot time ever cut by a ladder bar car is a small tribute to that original insight. Every racer who bolted on a $50 solution instead of spending thousands on a four-link conversion and ran competitive times anyway is living proof that the insight was correct. The physics were right, the geometry was right, and the accessibility was intentional, even if only intuitively so. You don't build something from the cheapest possible materials with the simplest possible construction unless, on some level, you want other people to be able to do what you're doing. Next time you're at a drag strip, take a moment before you look at the engines or the paint or the bodywork. Crouch down and look under the rear of the leaf spring cars in the pit. When you see those simple parallel bars running from the axle housing forward to the frame, remember that you're looking at one of the most consequential innovations in the history of the sport. Remember that those tubes, which look almost too simple to matter, changed who could afford to compete. Remember that an 18-year-old kid from Tennessee figured out in an afternoon what millions of dollars in professional racing development hadn't managed to solve affordably. And remember that sometimes the most lasting innovations aren't the ones that are the most complex or the most expensive. They're the ones that understand the problem precisely enough to solve it with exactly as much as the problem requires, and nothing more. Drop a comment below and tell us whether you've run ladder bars, whether you've got a garage innovation story of your own where the simple solution beat the expensive alternative. And if this kind of deep dive into the engineering stories that shaped motorsport history is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed because we have more of these stories to tell. The best ones always involve someone refusing to accept that they couldn't afford to go fast. What if I told you two guys from Texas pulled 700 horsepower from a naturally aspirated engine back in 1965, and the racing authorities got so scared they had to ban it? No turbos, no superchargers, no nitrous. Just raw, brilliant engineering that forced one of Detroit's biggest automakers to scramble and build a secret part just to keep up. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about legendary engine builds and the unsung geniuses behind them. If you're someone who geeks out over drag racing history, classic muscle car engineering, and the innovations that changed American motorsports forever, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Alright, let me paint you a picture. It's a warm Texas evening in 1965. The air smells like burnt rubber and race fuel. Down in the staging lanes of a local drag strip, a Plymouth Belvedere is rolling up to the line. Nothing about this car looks particularly special from the outside. It's a full-bodied production car, white paint, stock bodywork, the kind of thing you'd pass on a highway without a second glance. But lift that hood and you immediately understand something is different. Very different. Instead of the single 4-barrel carburetor everyone expects to see sitting on top of a 426 Hemi, there are two 4-barrel carburetors, angled and crossed over each other in a configuration nobody at this track has ever seen before. The engine fires up with a lumpy, aggressive idle that sounds like it's barely holding itself together at low RPM. Other racers in the staging area stop what they're doing and stare. Some lean in for a closer look. Some take a step back. The Christmas tree counts down, the light goes green, and that Plymouth launches so hard the front wheels come off the pavement. By the time it crosses the quarter-mile mark, everybody watching knows they've just witnessed something that is going to change drag racing. And they're right. Now, you might be thinking, okay, big deal, people have been building fast drag cars since the 50s. What makes this particular engine combination so revolutionary that we're still talking about it 60 years later? Here's the thing. In 1965, making 500 horsepower from a naturally aspirated engine was considered an achievement. The fastest Cobras, the hottest Corvettes, the most aggressive factory muscle cars were working in that 400 to 500 horsepower range. Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin were pulling 700. And they were doing it with physics, ingenuity, and a lot of trial and error in a Texas race shop without a single computer to help them. To really understand what Sox and Martin accomplished, you need to understand the canvas they were working with. Chrysler released the 426 Hemi in 1964, and it immediately became the most feared engine in American motorsport. The name comes from the combustion chamber shape, hemispherical, instead of the flat or wedge-shaped combustion chambers that most engines of the era used. The Hemi had a dome-shaped chamber that allowed for much larger valves and a much more efficient flame front during combustion. We're talking 2.25-inch intake valves and 1.94-inch exhaust valves. Those numbers are enormous even by modern standard. The bore was 4.25 inches with a 3.75-inch stroke, giving you a relatively short stroke design that allowed the engine to rev cleanly without the mechanical stress that kills long-stroke engines at high RPM. Compression ratio from the factory sat at 12.5 to 1, which was aggressive for a street engine but reasonable for a purpose-built race motor. Chrysler's official horsepower rating was 425 at 6,000 revolutions per minute, but here's what most people don't realize. That number was complete fiction. Chrysler was sandbagging, deliberately underrating the power output to throw off the competition and avoid regulatory headache. Actual dyno testing consistently showed these engines producing closer to 470 to 480 horsepower with factory calibration. Sometimes more. The engine was so dominant in its first NASCAR season that it won 37 of 49 races in 1964. 37 out of 49. NASCAR responded by banning it for 1965, which forced Chrysler to temporarily pull out of stock car racing entirely. But while NASCAR was shutting the door on the Hemi, the NHRA's super stock class was still open for business. And that's where Sox and Martin were going to make history. Ronnie Sox was the driver. Quiet, focused, and possessed of reaction times that other racers genuinely believed bordered on superhuman. He had relocated from North Carolina to Texas and built a reputation for consistency that made him dangerous regardless of what car he was sitting in. Buddy Martin was the mechanical mind behind the operation, a tuner with an almost supernatural ability to diagnose engine problems by feel and sound before any instrument confirmed them. Together they'd been competitive in Texas drag racing since the early 60s, and when the 426 Hemi became available, they immediately recognized both its potential and its limitations. The limitation was the intake manifold and carburation setup. The stock Hemi used a single 4-barrel carburetor sitting on a manifold designed to provide a broad, tractable power band suitable for NASCAR's high-speed oval track. That's great for Charlotte Motor Speedway. It's not optimal for a quarter-mile drag strip where you need maximum power delivered in a very specific, very narrow RPM window. Buddy Martin understood that the single 4-barrel setup was essentially a bottleneck. At high RPM, that one carburetor simply could not flow enough air to fully feed those massive hemispherical combustion chambers. The engine was, in effect, choking on its own potential. So Martin started thinking about a solution, and the solution he came up with was rooted in fluid dynamics and a phenomenon called ram tuning. Here's where it gets really interesting. When an intake valve closes during the engine cycle, it doesn't just stop the flow of air and fuel. It creates a pressure wave, almost like a small shock wave, that travels back up the intake runner toward the carburetor. Now, if the intake runner is exactly the right length, that pressure wave bounces off the plenum and travels back down the runner, arriving at the intake valve at precisely the moment it opens for the next intake cycle. When that happens, the returning pressure wave literally rams additional air into the cylinder, compressing the charge beyond atmospheric pressure without any mechanical assistance. It's free supercharging. Physics doing the work that a blower would otherwise do. But here's the catch. Ram tuning only works at specific RPM ranges because the timing of the pressure wave depends on the length of the runner and the speed at which the valve is opening and closing. For maximum power at the 6,000 revolutions per minute range where Sox and Martin wanted to shift, Martin calculated they needed intake runners approximately 15 inches long. And here is where the conventional wisdom of the era completely breaks down, because a 15-inch runner on a conventional straight-down intake manifold simply does not fit under the hood of a Plymouth Belvedere. There is not enough vertical space. It is physically impossible with a traditional manifold design. So Martin did something that seems obvious in hindsight, but that nobody had actually executed on a Hemi before. He crossed the runners. Instead of running straight down from carburetor to cylinder head port, the runners crossed over the top of the engine. The left carburetor fed the right bank of cylinders. The right carburetor fed the left bank. The crossing of the runners gave him the runner length he needed, approximately 15 inches, while keeping the overall package low enough to fit under the stock hood with a small clearance modification. That crossing configuration also solved another problem Martin had been wrestling with. By positioning one carburetor over each bank of cylinders but feeding the opposite bank, the airflow velocity entering the runners was more uniform across all 8 cylinders. On a conventional manifold, cylinders closest to the carburetor tend to get a richer mixture, while cylinders at the far ends of the runners run slightly lean. That imbalance costs power and can cause destructive detonation in the lean cylinders. The cross-ram design largely eliminated this problem by equalizing the runner lengths to all 8 cylinders. Every cylinder got the same shot of air and fuel at the same mixture strength. The geometry was elegant, and honestly, it was the kind of solution that makes you slap your forehead and wonder why nobody had done it sooner, except that fabricating it in 1965 without modern manufacturing tools was an absolute nightmare. Martin spent months on prototype. We're talking hand-formed aluminum runners, carefully welded together, then cut apart and reformed when the measurements were slightly off. He didn't have a flow bench readily available. He didn't have computer fluid dynamics modeling. He had a tape measure, a calculator, reference texts on fluid mechanics, and an engine dynamometer that gave him real-world feedback after every modification. Each iteration of the manifold required new jetting for the carburetors because the airflow characteristics were completely different from anything the carburetor manufacturers had calibrated for. The fuel curves had to be rebuilt essentially from scratch. The float levels needed adjustment because the angled mounting position of the carburetors affected fuel delivery in ways that weren't obvious until you actually ran the engine under load. It was painstaking, iterative work, and for months the results were promising but not definitive. The power was up, but not dramatically. Martin kept refining. The breakthrough came when he stopped thinking about the manifold in isolation and started thinking about the entire intake system as one continuous component from the carburetor venturi all the way to the valve seat. He adjusted the carburetor spacers to optimize plenum volume for the specific RPM range they were targeting. He matched the manifold ports to the cylinder head ports by hand, carefully blending the transition between the two surfaces to eliminate any turbulence-creating steps or lip. And he recalibrated the accelerator pump circuits on both carburetors to account for the longer time it took fuel to travel through the extended runners before reaching the combustion chamber. When he put the modified engine back on the dyno with all of those refinements in place simultaneously, the number on the gauge jumped dramatically. The naturally aspirated 426 Hemi with the cross-ram manifold was producing 585 horsepower. That was more than 100 horsepower over the stock configuration. And Martin immediately understood they weren't done yet. Now, you might be thinking, okay, 585 horsepower is already phenomenal for 1965. Why push further? Because in racing, there is no such thing as enough. And because Martin could see clearly from the data that the engine was still leaving power on the table in specific areas. The cylinder heads, even the excellent Hemi castings, had casting flash and slight irregularities in the port throats from the factory machining process. None of it was severe enough to cause problems in street use, but at the airflow speeds they were now generating with the cross-ram setup, those imperfections were creating tiny turbulent zones that robbed velocity. Martin spent 3 weeks with a die grinder and carbide bits cleaning up those ports. Not porting in the radical, material-removing sense that some engine builders use. Just cleaning, blending, and smoothing. Matching surfaces, removing casting seams, polishing the valve seats to promote better airflow around the valve head. When the heads went back on with the cross-ram manifold, power climbed to 620 horsepower. Then came compression. The stock 12.5-to-1 ratio was conservative for an engine that would only ever see race fuel. Martin pushed it to 13.5-to-1 using custom dome pistons, then to 14-to-1 with a second revision. At 14-to-1, the engine required 103-octane fuel to avoid detonation, but power had climbed to 650 horsepower. The cam timing was the final major variable. Factory Hemi camshafts were ground for a broad power band because that's what NASCAR and street performance require. Sox and Martin needed a narrow, concentrated power band centered precisely where they were going to use the engine, between 5,500 and 6,500 revolutions per minute. They had custom camshafts ground with 320 degrees of duration and 0.590-inch lift. The overlap between intake and exhaust events was so aggressive that the engine would barely maintain idle below 2,000 revolutions per minute. At low speeds it sounded ragged and unhappy, like something was deeply wrong. But at 6,000 revolutions per minute it was absolutely ferocious, pulling hard with a mechanical intensity that you could feel in your chest from across the track. With all of these modifications combined, the cross-ram Hemi was producing a verified 700 horsepower on the dynamometer. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 700 horsepower. Naturally aspirated. In 1965. When a Shelby Cobra 427 with its brutal side-oiler Ford motor was making approximately 485 horsepower and was widely considered barely streetable due to its extreme power output. When the hottest Corvette you could order from a dealer made 375 horsepower and was considered an exotic performance machine. Sox and Martin had surpassed all of that by more than 200 horsepower using an intake manifold they'd essentially invented in a Texas race shop. And they'd done it within the basic framework of a production-based engine that competitors could identify and inspect without finding anything that looked unreasonable. The displacement was stock. The heads were stock castings that had been cleaned up. The block was unmodified. The cross-ram manifold was unusual, certainly, but the rules hadn't specifically addressed it yet. And that last point was going to become very significant very soon. Here's what most people don't realize about the cross-ram setup beyond the raw horsepower numbers. There were secondary performance benefits built into the design that Sox and Martin discovered somewhat accidentally during testing. The long runners, by virtue of their length and the fact that they were surrounded by moving air rather than sitting directly on hot engine components, acted as crude but effective heat exchangers. The intake charge traveling through those runners was measurably cooler by the time it reached the intake ports compared to a conventional short-runner manifold sitting in the radiant heat of the engine valley. Cooler air is denser air. Denser air means more oxygen molecules packed into the same volume, which means more fuel can be burned, which means more power. Martin estimated the thermal benefit of the long-runner cross-ram design was worth somewhere between 20 and 25 additional horsepower above and beyond the ram tuning effect. That's free power from geometry alone. Additionally, the two carburetors could be tuned and calibrated independently of each other, which opened up possibilities that a single carburetor setup simply couldn't offer. Martin developed what he called staged carburation, a progressively linked throttle system where the front carburetor opened first during the initial throttle application. At approximately 60% throttle, the rear carburetor began opening, reaching full throttle simultaneously with the front unit just as the engine entered the peak power RPM range. This solved one of the most persistent problems with multiple carburetor setups, which was the tendency to flood the engine with excess fuel at low RPM during hard launches, causing the engine to hesitate or bog momentarily before recovering. With staged carburation, the launch was crisp and clean, the power delivery was linear and progressive, and by the time both carburetors were fully open the engine was already in its optimal operating range and pulling as hard as the physics allowed. The first time Sox and Martin showed up at an NHRA event with the cross-ram Hemi, the reaction from other competitors ranged from confusion to outright disbelief. Their Plymouth Belvedere was running elapsed times in the 10.90s at trap speeds approaching 127 miles per hour in a full-bodied production car running on bias-ply tires with essentially stock suspension geometry. Those numbers belonged in a different class entirely. Competitors started circulating accusations almost immediately. There had to be nitrous. The engine had to be stroked beyond its claimed displacement. Something was hidden somewhere, because a naturally aspirated stock displacement engine in a production car body simply could not run those numbers. It defied conventional wisdom about what was possible. After a particularly dominant weekend performance, NHRA technical inspectors at the event requested a full teardown inspection of the engine. Sox and Martin agreed without hesitation. Every component came out and went onto the inspection table. Displacement check came back at 425.9 cubic inches. Exactly stock. No hidden passages for nitrous delivery. No exotic materials that violated the rules. Nothing illegal. Just the cross-ram manifold sitting there looking unusual and somehow managing to produce power numbers that made the inspectors uncomfortable even though they couldn't find a single violation to cite. Word spread through the super stock community with the speed that characterizes racing gossip. By the time Sox and Martin appeared at the next major event, photographers were waiting specifically to document that intake manifold. Technical directors from other racing organizations were in attendance taking note, and other Hemi-powered competitors were already calling aluminum fabricators asking about the feasibility of building their own versions. The cross-ram had become the most talked-about development in drag racing, and Sox and Martin had built exactly one of them in a Texas race shop with hand tools and determination. Dick Landy, another prominent and highly successful Mopar racer of the era, was running a conventional single four-barrel Hemi and losing ground fast. Landy was no amateur. He was one of the most mechanically sophisticated racers in the country and a fierce competitor. but his best runs were consistently half a second slower than Sox and Martin's worst runs. Half a second in drag racing is an eternity. It's the difference between winning every round and going home in the first elimination. Other teams began reverse engineering the cross-ram concept. Some got the basic geometry right but missed the crucial details of runner length calculation and carburetor staging. An engine with cross-ram induction and incorrectly calculated runner lengths actually performs worse than a well-tuned conventional manifold because the pressure waves arrive at the wrong time and work against cylinder filling rather than enhancing it. Several teams discovered this the hard way on the dynamometer, watching their power numbers drop after installing hastily fabricated cross-ram setups and concluding that Sox and Martin must have some other secret they hadn't shared. The secret was the math. Martin had done the calculations correctly from first principles, and without understanding the underlying fluid dynamics, it was impossible to copy the design by eye and get the same result. But by mid-1966, enough teams had figured it out, some through their own calculations and some through careful measurement of dimensions from the Sox and Martin manifold during pit area inspections, that the cross-ram Hemi had become the dominant configuration in superstock. The single four-barrel cars were being systematically outclassed. The NHRA found itself in an increasingly difficult position. The cross-ram Hemis were spectacular cars to watch, and they were drawing fans to events specifically to see them run. Sox and Martin had become genuine stars of the sport, and the cross-ram Plymouth was their calling card. But the rules were written around production-based components, and Chrysler had never offered a cross-ram intake manifold for the 426 Hemi through any official production or dealer channel. The argument from teams protesting the design was straightforward. Production-based racing means you race what the factory builds. The factory didn't build this. Therefore it shouldn't be legal. Sox and Martin's counter-argument was that the rules specified stock-appearing components and their setup appeared stock. The visual inspection criterion could be interpreted either way depending on your definition of stock appearing. The controversy came to a definitive head at the 1966 NHRA Spring Nationals in Bristol, Tennessee. Sox and Martin had just posted a new national record, running a 10.98 at 128 miles per hour to win their class. The run was witnessed by approximately 40,000 spectators and captured on film by multiple cameras. It was, by any objective measure, one of the most impressive drag racing performances anyone had ever seen from a super stock class vehicle. During the mandatory post-race technical inspection, Dick Landy filed a formal protest specifically targeting the cross-ram manifold and its eligibility under the production-based rules. NHRA officials pulled out the rulebook. 3 hours of deliberation followed, with officials consulting with technical advisors, reviewing the written rules with multiple interpretations, and ultimately having a difficult conversation about the difference between what the rules said and what they had intended to say when written. The ruling turned on a single word: production. The rules specified production intake manifolds. The NHRA determined that since Chrysler had not produced and sold the cross-ram design through any official channel as a purchasable production component, it did not qualify under that definition. Sox and Martin were not retroactively disqualified. The NHRA acknowledged the innovative nature of the design and the fact that the rules had simply not anticipated it. But beginning with the 1967 season, all intake manifolds would be required to be factory production units available through dealer parts departments. The announcement gave everyone 6 months. And here is where the story takes a turn that you genuinely could not make up. Chrysler's racing division, which had been monitoring the Sox and Martin situation with a combination of corporate pride and institutional embarrassment, moved with remarkable speed after the NHRA announcement. Their own engineers had actually tested a cross-ram configuration during the Hemi's original development in 1963. Internal documents released decades later confirm this. They had seen similar power gains to what Sox and Martin were achieving. But they had rejected the design for 2 reasons. First, the tall profile of the crossram made hood clearance problematic on production vehicles. Second, the complex manifold would have added approximately $400 to the already substantial price of the Hemi option, which Chrysler's marketing team believed would hurt sales. So Chrysler had known this was possible. They had tested it and walked away from it. Then two independent racers proved it worked and built an entire winning program around it. And now the NHRA was forcing Chrysler's hand. Within weeks of the Bristol ruling, Chrysler's parts division announced the production of a cross-ram intake manifold for the 426 Hemi, assigned part number P4529068. Under NHRA regulations, a minimum of 50 units needed to be produced and made available for purchase to qualify as a production component. Chrysler built exactly 50. They priced them at $850 each, which in 1966 dollars represents an extraordinary sum, roughly equivalent to $6,000 or $7,000 today. All 50 units sold within 48 hours of becoming available, purchased almost exclusively by professional superstock racing teams including Sox and Martin themselves. The manifold was never listed in any public Chrysler parts catalog. It was never advertised in any publication. It was never produced again after that initial run of 50 units. But it was technically a production component manufactured and sold by the Chrysler Corporation, which made it legal for NHRA competition beginning in the 1967 season. Think carefully about what just happened there. Two independent racers from Texas built something in their shop that was so effective and so clearly superior that one of the three largest automobile manufacturers in the world was forced to legitimize their innovation by rushing it into limited production specifically to maintain its legal status in racing. Chrysler didn't build the crossram manifold because they thought it was a good business decision. They built it because Sox and Martin had proven it was the fastest configuration possible, and without making it a production part, one of the best draws in their racing program would have become illegal. That is the automotive equivalent of a garage band's demo tape being so good that a major record label releases it as an official album just to acknowledge that it exists. The 1967 and 1968 Superstock seasons belonged to Sox and Martin in a way that is almost difficult to describe with numbers alone. They won 57 NHRA events across those two seasons, a record that survived for decades. Their Plymouth ran in the 10.80s at trap speeds consistently above 130 miles per hour at a time when breaking into the 10s in a production-bodied car still represented a genuine engineering achievement. Other teams running the cross-ram Hemi were competitive, but there was always a gap between what everyone else could produce from the combination and what Sox and Martin extracted. Part of that gap was the staging carburation system that remained uniquely theirs. Part of it was the ceramic coating Martin had applied to the inside of the intake runners, a thermal barrier treatment that reduced heat transfer from the engine to the incoming air charge and dropped intake temperatures by approximately 40 degrees Fahrenheit. At a rate of roughly 3% power gain per 10-degree reduction in intake temperature, that coating was worth approximately 12% more power. On a 650 horsepower base, that adds up to another 78 horsepower. Free. From a coating applied to the inside of aluminum runners. Part of the gap was also the exhaust system, which Martin had developed simultaneously with the intake modifications but which received far less attention because it was less visually dramatic. The standard Hemi exhaust headers of the era, while significantly better than the factory cast-iron manifolds, created interference between exhaust pulses from adjacent cylinders in the collectors. When two exhaust pulses arrive at a collector at nearly the same time, they partially cancel each other out, creating back pressure that resists the outflow of exhaust gases and robs power. Martin addressed this by rearranging the pairing of cylinders in the exhaust collectors, using what he called 180-degree headers where the cylinder firing intervals were evenly spaced in each collector rather than grouped as they naturally fell in the firing order. Evenly spaced exhaust pulses in the collectors created a scavenging effect instead of a cancellation effect, where the exiting exhaust pulse from one cylinder actually pulled the exhaust gases from the next cylinder out behind it. This scavenging reduced residual exhaust gases remaining in the combustion chamber at the start of the next intake stroke, which meant cleaner combustion and higher effective compression. Martin estimated the 180-degree headers were worth 15 to 20 horsepower over the conventional arrangement. Combined with all the other modifications simultaneously, the best verified output recorded from a Sox and Martin Crossram Hemi was 738 horsepower at 6,800 revolutions per minute. 738 horsepower. Naturally aspirated. 1965 technology. It's a number that remains impressive today. Now you might be thinking, surely modern engines make more power than that from the same displacement. And yes, of course they do. A modern 7.0-liter LS7 from a Corvette Z06 makes 505 horsepower from the factory, and with careful naturally aspirated building, it can reach 700 or more. But that engine uses computer-designed cylinder heads with flow numbers that weren't achievable with 1960s manufacturing, computer-optimized camshaft profiles, precision fuel injection, and decades of accumulated knowledge. Sox and Martin were doing this without any of those advantages, working from first principles with hand tools, a dynamometer, and a deep understanding of physics. The achievement scales completely differently when you account for the resources available. Here's what most people don't realize about the broader context of what Sox and Martin accomplished. The physics principles they were exploiting in 1965 weren't mysterious or arcane. They were documented in fluid dynamics textbooks. The ram tuning effect had been understood theoretically for decades before this. What was remarkable was that Sox and Martin applied those principles practically, in the real world, under racing conditions, without the computational tools that would normally be required to design a system like the cross-ram manifold from scratch. They essentially reverse-engineered the physics through iterative testing, which is a form of engineering that requires both intelligence and an almost obsessive willingness to try, fail, measure, adjust, and try again. Buddy Martin reportedly destroyed or rebuilt the manifold prototype more than a dozen times before arriving at the final configuration that produced the power numbers they were seeking. That's not luck. That's methodology applied with extraordinary persistence. The psychological effect of the Cross-Ram Hemi on the broader superstock racing community was arguably as important as its actual performance advantage. When Sox and Martin pulled their transporter into a race venue and opened the hood of the Plymouth, the reaction from other competitors was immediate and visceral. The twin four-barrel carburetors sitting atop those crossed runners, combined with the distinctive ragged idle of the aggressive camshaft, communicated a clear message before a single competitive run had been made. This car is serious. This car is different. This car is going to be very hard to beat. Racing is as much psychology as it is machinery, and there is measurable value in making your opponent doubt themselves before the tree goes green. Sox and Martin understood this intuitively, and they leaned into it deliberately, keeping the hood up in the staging lanes longer than strictly necessary, letting the crowd gather, letting the opposition look and wonder. The NHRA's tightening of the rules for 1969, mandating that intake manifolds must be available as regular production options rather than specially produced limited runs, effectively ended the cross-ram era in its original form. Chrysler was not going to tool up for mass production of a manifold that required significant hood modification to fit and served no practical street use. Sox and Martin transitioned to the Chrysler six-pack configuration, 3 two-barrel carburetors on a conventional manifold design offered on the 440 cubic inch engine and later adapted for the 426 Hemi. The six-pack was capable of approximately 550 horsepower in race trim, well below the Crossram's peak output, but it was legal, it was available through dealer channels, and Sox and Martin's deep mechanical knowledge meant they were still competitive even with the reduced power ceiling. The transition to the six-pack era also illustrated something important about the nature of racing innovation under regulations. Rules don't eliminate the drive to innovate. They redirect it. When Sox and Martin could no longer run the cross-ram, they applied the same methodical approach to the six-pack configuration that they had applied to everything before it. They found carburetor jetting combinations that other teams hadn't considered. They developed staged linkage systems for the three carburetors that improved off-the-line response. They optimized the manifold port matching with the same careful attention to airflow they'd applied to the cross-ram head. And while the six-pack setup never matched the outright power of the cross-ram Hemi, Sox and Martin consistently extracted more from it than their competitors were finding, which speaks to the depth of their mechanical understanding rather than their reliance on any single trick or component. But it's the cross-ram legacy that endures most powerfully, both in the specific technical concepts it introduced to drag racing and in what it represented philosophically about the relationship between independent racers and the manufacturers whose equipment they campaigned. Look at the modern high-performance automotive landscape, and you'll find the fingerprints of the cross-ram everywhere, even if they're not immediately recognizable. Variable length intake manifolds, which are standard equipment on engines ranging from BMW's M Series to Honda's VTEC designs to the Dodge Viper's V10, use exactly the same ram tuning physics that Martin calculated for the cross-ram manifold. The difference is that modern implementations use computer-controlled butterflies or sliding runners to change the effective runner length dynamically across the entire RPM range, optimizing the ram effect at low speeds, mid-range, and high RPM simultaneously rather than committing to a fixed length for a single target RPM. The principle is identical. The execution is more sophisticated because modern computing power makes dynamic optimization feasible. But the physics haven't changed since 1965, and the physics were what Martin understood and applied. The staged carburation concept that Sox and Martin pioneered in their progressive throttle linkage system is the mechanical grandfather of modern throttle-by-wire systems. Contemporary electronic throttle control doesn't just translate your foot movement directly to throttle opening. It interprets your inputs and modulates throttle opening based on engine speed, vehicle speed, gear position, and dozens of other parameters to optimize power delivery and traction. The fundamental goal, controlling the rate at which air enters the engine to optimize power delivery relative to where the engine is in its operating range, is identical to what Martin accomplished mechanically with his staged carburation linkage. He was solving a throttle management problem in 1965 that modern engineers solve with software and sensors. The problem itself hasn't changed. The ceramic thermal barrier coating that Martin applied to the inside of the cross-ram runners is now common practice in professional drag racing and has trickled into high-performance street applications. Top fuel dragsters use ceramic-coated intake component. Many aftermarket supercharger kits now include optional thermal coatings for intercooler component. High-performance diesel trucks use thermally coated EGR components to manage heat transfer. The concept of managing heat as a power variable rather than just a reliability concern, which Martin understood intuitively and applied practically in 1965, is now a standard tool in the performance engineer's toolkit. The 180-degree headers that Martin developed to eliminate exhaust pulse interference in the collectors have become standard in professional-level drag racing. Any serious top fuel, funny car, or pro-modified program uses collector arrangements specifically designed to maximize scavenging rather than allowing pulse interference. Most performance header manufacturers now offer what they call tri-Y or 4-into-1 designs specifically optimized for scavenging in particular RPM ranges, which is the same engineering goal Martin was pursuing with his custom header arrangements. Here's what most people don't realize when they think about the Sox and Martin story in historical context. The 700-horsepower cross-ram Hemi wasn't just an impressive power output for the era. It was a proof of concept that naturally aspirated engines had significantly more potential than the engineering consensus of the 1960s believed possible. The prevailing view in factory racing departments was that naturally aspirated engines had practical limits well below what Sox and Martin achieved, and that exceeding those limits required either displacement increases, exotic fuels, or mechanical supercharging. Martin's crossram proved that the limiting factor wasn't the engine's thermodynamic potential. It was the quality of the breathing system. Feed the engine air more efficiently, at the right velocity, at the right temperature, in the right quantities, at the right moment in the valve cycle, and the potential was substantially higher than accepted wisdom suggested. That insight, which seems obvious in retrospect, was genuinely revolutionary in its time. It shifted the focus of performance engineering from brute displacement and compression to precision airflow management, a shift that defined the next several decades of racing engine development. The market value of surviving Sox and Martin crossram components today reflects not just collector sentiment but genuine historical significance. A complete engine from the era, documented to have been built by Martin's shop and raced by the Sox and Martin team, sold at auction in 2019 for $127,000. Not a complete car. Just the engine. One of the original 50 Chrysler-produced P452906-8 crossram manifolds, documented with its original serial number and paperwork, changed hands in a private sale for $34,000. These aren't just vintage parts. They're primary source documents from a specific moment in American motorsports history when two men with hand tools and deep physics knowledge changed what everybody thought was possible. When a garage shop operation forced a billion-dollar corporation to scramble and build a special production component specifically to legitimize their innovation. When the speed record books were rewritten not by a factory team with unlimited resources but by a driver with supernatural reaction times and a mechanic who could hear a pressure wave in an intake runner. There is a specific type of American story that gets told across many different domains, about the independent operator who sees something that the institutional experts have missed and proves it with results that can't be argued with. In technology, it's the garage startup that outmaneuvers the established corporation. In music, it's the independent artist whose self-produced record exposes the formula thinking of major labels. In motorsports, in 1965, it was Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin looking at Chrysler's 426 Hemi and seeing not a finished product but a starting point. Seeing not an engine that had been optimized but an engine that had been designed for a different purpose than the one they needed it for. And having the knowledge, the tools, the persistence, and the competitive fire to transform it into something that the factory engineers who created it hadn't been able to imagine. And I want to be clear about something here, because this is where a lot of people who know the broad outlines of the Sox and Martin story miss the deeper significance. Look, the 700 horsepower number gets repeated in every article about these cars, and it should because it's extraordinary. But the number alone undersells what was actually accomplished. 700 horsepower from a naturally aspirated engine in 1965 is impressive. The method used to get there is genius. And the implications of that method, the fact that it validated and popularized an approach to intake design that became fundamental to high-performance engine building across the next 6 decades, that's what makes the crossram Hemi genuinely historically important rather than just historically impressive. Think about the specific cascade of consequences that flows from Martin building that first crossram manifold in his Texas race shop. The immediate consequence is obvious. Sox and Martin win a lot of races and set record. But one level deeper, the crossram's success forces Chrysler to produce P452906-8, which creates a documented production part that legitimizes the design for competition and puts those specs into the hands of every team that purchases one of those 50 manifold. Those teams study the dimensions, understand the runner lengths, grasp the geometry, and carry that knowledge forward into their own future projects. 2 levels deeper, The NHRA's rule changes in response to the Crossram's dominance set a precedent for how the organization handles technological innovation that outpaces the existing rulebook. That precedent shapes how racing authorities across multiple sanctioning bodies approach similar situations for the next several decades. 3 levels deeper, the engineers at Chrysler and at other manufacturers who are paying attention to superstock racing in 1966 and 1967 internalize the lesson that long-runner, crossover-style intake designs produce superior power density per cubic inch, and that knowledge influences how they approach production engine design going forward. The variable-length intake manifolds that appear on production cars in the 1980s and become ubiquitous in the 1990s and 2000s have multiple lineages, but the line connecting them back to Buddy Martin's shop in Texas is real. Here's the thing about innovation in motorsports that gets lost in the celebration of specific victories and specific records. The most important contributions aren't always the fastest runs or the most dominant seasons. Sometimes the most important contributions are the ones that change how everybody else thinks about what's possible. The Crossram Hemi did both. It won races, yes. It set records, absolutely. But more importantly, it demonstrated to an entire generation of engine builders that the factory solution was rarely the final answer, that independent analysis of the underlying physics could reveal improvements that institutional inertia and cost constraints had prevented the factories from pursuing, and that the gap between what existed and what was possible was often larger than the experts believed. Ronnie Sox retired from professional drag racing in the mid-1970s. Buddy Martin continued as an engine builder and tuner for other teams, his reputation established so firmly by the Crossram Hemi program that he had no shortage of clients willing to trust him with their race engines. The Plymouth Belvedere in which so many of those record-setting runs were made has passed through several owners and most recently been documented in a private collection in the southeastern United States, still wearing its original livery, its engine bay empty of the Crossram setup, which lives separately as the museum-quality artifact it has become. The car and the engine together in original configuration would represent one of the most valuable complete drag racing artifacts from the 1960s, a time capsule from the specific moment when American motorsports was figuring out that the factory was not the ceiling, that the factory was just the floor. Now, you might be thinking, why does any of this matter in 2024, when drag racing has evolved so far beyond anything Sox and Martin would recognize that the connection feels almost abstract? And here's my answer to that. It matters because the story of the Crossram Hemi is fundamentally a story about intellectual curiosity applied to a practical problem, about refusing to accept that what already exists is the best possible answer, about doing the work, the real work, the iterative, failure-tolerant, physics-grounded work of actually understanding why something performs the way it does rather than simply accepting it. Those habits of mind don't become obsolete. The specific application changes with the technology, but the approach, questioning the assumption, calculating from first principles, testing rigorously, revising honestly, that approach is as relevant in 2024 as it was in 1965. It's as relevant in any technical discipline as it is in racing. Sox and Martin weren't the last independent racers to outsmart a factory program. They won't be the last. But they were among the first to do it so completely, so publicly, and with such verifiable, undeniable results that the factory had to respond by essentially adopting their solution. That's a specific kind of victory that goes beyond any individual race win or championship. It's the victory of a good idea over institutional inertia, of knowledge over assumption, of 2 guys in a Texas garage over an engineering department with 1,000 times their resources. And the Crossram Hemi, sitting in its private collection today, still carries that story in every welded runner and every hand-blended port. Still represents that moment when racing was simple enough that 2 people with deep knowledge and fierce determination could change everything. Still makes that argument, as powerfully as it ever did, that the best solution isn't always the factory solution, and that sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come not from the biggest building with the biggest budget, but from the person willing to do the math, build the prototype, run the test, tear it apart, and do it all over again until the dyno says what it needs to say. What's the most innovative engine modification you've ever come across? Drop it in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know what you think belongs in the same conversation as the Crossram Hemi. If you want more deep dives into the engines, the racers, and the engineering decisions that shaped American motorsports, subscribe to Legacy Motoring. We're here every week, and I promise you we have not run out of stories worth telling.